London, 1852. The drizzle that had persisted throughout the morning had finally ceased, though the sky remained a dismal grey as Beatrice Zephyr made her way along the cobblestone streets of London. The hem of her modest grey dress was spattered with mud, but she paid it little mind. Her appearance had long ceased to be of much importance to her. She paused before the imposing townhouse, checking the address once more against the creased paper in her gloved hand. Though the gloves were worn thin at the fingertips, they served their purpose, concealing the scars that snaked across her hands and wrists like pale rivers, constant reminders of that terrible night 5 years ago. "This must be it," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the clatter of passing carriages. The advertisement had been specific: a governess needed for a young girl of 7 years, recently orphaned and now in the care of her uncle. The wages offered were generous, more than Beatrice had dared hope for after being dismissed from her previous position. Lady Harrington had been quite clear that she could not keep a governess with such an unfortunate appearance teaching her daughters, lest they be frightened. Beatrice touched her face unconsciously, her fingers tracing the jagged scar that ran from her right temple down her cheek to the corner of her mouth. It pulled slightly when she smiled, not that she had much cause for smiling these days. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she climbed the steps and lifted the brass knocker. She had learned long ago that the world had little use for a scarred woman of no fortune or connections. Beauty was currency in society, and she was bankrupt. Yet she persisted, clinging to the belief that if she worked hard enough, lived quietly enough, she might carve out a small, solitary existence where her scars, both visible and hidden, would not matter. The door swung open, revealing a stern-faced butler who regarded her with immediate disdain. "Yes?" he inquired, his gaze flickering momentarily to her scarred cheek before returning to a fixed point somewhere above her head. "I am Miss Zephyr. I've come about the governess position," Beatrice said, straightening her spine and meeting his gaze directly. She had learned that showing weakness only invited further contempt. "You're expected. Follow me." The butler's tone suggested he found her barely worth the effort of speech. Beatrice followed him through the grand entrance hall, her eyes taking in the opulence around her. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork adorned walls covered in silk damask. This was no ordinary household. "Wait here," the butler commanded, gesturing to a small parlor off the main hall. "Mrs. Grave, the housekeeper, will be with you shortly." Alone in the parlor, Beatrice removed her damp bonnet and smoothed her hair, which was pulled back in a severe bun. At 26, she was neither young enough to be considered fresh nor old enough to be entirely beyond notice. Not that it mattered. Her scars ensured she was noticed only with pity or revulsion. "Miss Zephyr, I presume." The voice came from behind her, causing Beatrice to turn sharply. The woman who had entered was tall and thin, her black dress and tight grey bun giving her the appearance of an austere crow. "Mrs. Grave?" Beatrice inquired, offering a slight curtsy. "Indeed, I am housekeeper to His Grace, the Duke of Kenswick," she said, her eyes performing the now familiar assessment of Beatrice's face. To her credit, her expression remained impassive. "You've come regarding the position of governess to Lady Sophia." "Yes, ma'am." "Your references." Mrs. Grave extended a hand. Beatrice produced the papers from her reticule, watching anxiously as the housekeeper reviewed them. "Lady Harrington speaks highly of your capabilities with languages and music, though she notes your employment was of short duration, Mrs. Grave remarked, her tone inviting explanation. "Lady Harrington felt my appearance might disturb her younger daughters," Beatrice admitted, having learned that directness often forestalled uncomfortable questions. "I see." Mrs. Grave folded the references and regarded Beatrice thoughtfully. "And the nature of your injuries?" "A fire, ma'am, 5 years ago." "I am sorry for your suffering," the housekeeper said, and for a moment genuine compassion flickered in her eyes. "However, I should warn you that His Grace is exceedingly particular about his household, especially regarding his niece. Lady Sophia has suffered greatly with the loss of her parents, and the Duke is protective of her sensibilities." "I understand," Beatrice said quietly, her heart sinking. Another rejection then. She would need to try elsewhere, though her prospects grew dimmer with each passing day. "That being said," Mrs. Grave continued, surprising her, His Grace values competence above all else. Lady Sophia requires a firm hand and an educated mind. Your qualifications are impressive." Hope fluttered in Beatrice's chest. "Thank you, ma'am." "Come, His Grace wishes to interview all candidates personally. He is in his study now." Beatrice followed Mrs. Grave through the grand hallway, climbing a sweeping staircase to the first floor. The house was unusually quiet for such a large residence. "His Grace is recently returned from his country estate," Mrs. Grave explained, as if sensing her thoughts. "Much of the staff remains there, as does Lady Sophia for the moment. If you are selected, you would be expected to depart for Kenswick Manor within the fortnight." They paused before an imposing oak door. Mrs. Grave knocked firmly. "Enter," came a deep voice from within. "Your Grace, Mrs." Grave said as they entered, "Miss Beatrice Zephyr for the governess position." The study was a masculine domain of dark wood and leather, lined with bookshelves that reached the high ceiling. Seated behind a massive desk was a man who could only be the Duke of Kenswick. He did not rise at their entrance, nor did he immediately look up from the papers before him. "Thank you, Mrs. Grave, that will be all," he said, still not looking up. The housekeeper departed, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. For several long moments, the Duke continued reading, leaving Beatrice to stand awkwardly before his desk. Finally, he set down his pen and looked up. Beatrice had been prepared for the usual reaction, the momentary shock, quickly masked, followed by pity or discomfort. What she was not prepared for was the sheer force of the Duke's presence. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps no more than 35, with strong, aristocratic features that spoke of generations of noble breeding. His hair was dark, with threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue that reminded her of a winter sky, were sharp with intelligence. He was, Beatrice realized with an unwelcome flutter in her stomach, a strikingly handsome man. Those penetrating eyes met hers, flickered briefly to her scar, then returned to hold her gaze. There was no disgust in his expression, no pity, merely an assessing coolness that was somehow more unnerving. "Miss Zephyr," he said, his voice cultured and commanding, "I understand you seek the position of governess to my niece." "Yes, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Lady Sophia is a child of considerable intelligence and equally considerable willfulness," the Duke stated. "She has driven away 3 governesses in the past year. What makes you believe you will fare any better?" "I cannot say that I will, Your Grace," Beatrice answered honestly. "But I can promise that I will not be intimidated by childish tantrums or manipulations. I believe that children, especially those who have suffered loss, require both structure and compassion." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, surprise perhaps at her candor. "An interesting perspective," he said. "And what qualifies you to provide such guidance?" "I was educated at Mrs. Thistlethwaite's Academy for Young Ladies, where I later served as an instructor for 3 years. I am proficient in French, Italian, music, drawing, and the usual feminine accomplishments, as well as mathematics and natural philosophy." "Unusual subjects for a woman," the Duke commented. "My father believed in education regardless of gender, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, then immediately regretted revealing even this small personal detail. "And yet you find yourself seeking employment as a governess rather than pursuing a more scholarly path." There was a question beneath his statement, one Beatrice had no intention of answering fully. "Life rarely follows the path we envision for ourselves, Your Grace," she said softly. For a moment, something that might have been understanding crossed his face before it returned to its impassive mask. "Indeed," he said. Then, abruptly, "How did you come by your scars, Miss Zephyr?" The blunt question caught her off guard. Most people preferred to pretend they didn't notice, or spoke of her accident in vague, hushed terms. "A fire, Your Grace, 5 years ago." "I gathered as much. I am asking for details." Beatrice swallowed hard. "My family's home burned. I was the only survivor." The Duke studied her with an intensity that made her want to flee. "You saved yourself from the fire." "No," she whispered. "I tried to save them, I failed." She expected him to dismiss her then and there. What parent or guardian, would want a failure responsible for a child's welfare. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the window, presenting her with his broad back. "My niece lost her parents in a carriage accident 6 months ago," he said, his voice oddly quiet. "She was with them but was thrown clear. She watched them die, unable to help. Since then, she has refused to speak a single word." Beatrice's heart ached for the child. "I'm deeply sorry, Your Grace." "Sophia needs someone who understands loss," the Duke continued, turning to face her. "Someone who will not treat her with the cloying pity that seems to be the default response of most adults to a child's grief." "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Beatrice said. "But they need to be allowed to feel their grief, not have it swept aside in the adult desire to return to normalcy." The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly. "Precisely," he said, returning to his desk and picking up her references. "Lady Harrington indicates that you were exceptional with her daughters, yet she terminated your employment." "Lady Harrington found my appearance disturbing," Beatrice stated flatly. "She feared I might frighten her younger children." "Absurd," the Duke muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, "I care little for appearances, Miss Zephyr. I care for results. My niece requires education, discipline, and understanding. Can you provide these things?" "I can, Your Grace. Even knowing that she may reject you, as she has others. Every child tests boundaries. I do not take such tests personally." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, decisively. "Very well, Miss Zephyr. The position is yours should you wish to accept it. You will receive £30 per annum with room and board. You will have every other Sunday afternoon to yourself, as well as 3 days of holiday at Christmas and Easter." The terms were generous, far more than she had earned in any previous position. "Thank you, Your Grace, I accept." "Good." He picked up his pen, a clear dismissal. "Mrs. Grave will see to the details. You will depart for Kenswick Manor on Friday." "So soon?" Beatrice couldn't help but ask. The Duke looked up, one dark eyebrow raised. "Is that a problem, Miss Zephyr?" "No, Your Grace. I simply need to collect my belongings and give notice at my lodgings." "See that you do. Good day." Beatrice curtsied and turned to leave, feeling oddly shaken by the encounter. The Duke of Kenswick was unlike any employer she had ever had, direct, intimidating, and possessed of a penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away pretense. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Zephyr." She turned. "Yes, Your Grace. My niece has suffered greatly. She deserves compassion but not pity. I trust you understand the distinction." "I do, Your Grace." "Then we shall get along famously." The barest hint of a smile touched his lips before he returned his attention to his papers. As Beatrice left the study, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet fathom. Kenswick Manor loomed against the darkening sky, its Gothic towers and turrets silhouetted by the setting sun. As the carriage approached along the winding drive, Beatrice could not suppress a frisson of apprehension. The house was immense, far larger than she had anticipated, and possessed of a brooding grandeur that seemed to warn visitors away rather than welcome them. The journey from London had taken the better part of 2 days, and Beatrice was weary to her bones. The Duke had travelled separately, departing the day before with only a curt message that he would see her upon her arrival at the manor. "Intimidating, isn't it?" remarked Mr. Simmons, the Duke's secretary, who had accompanied her on the journey. He was a slight man with thinning hair and spectacles, the only member of the household who had treated her with genuine kindness thus far. "Don't worry. It's less forbidding inside." "It's magnificent," Beatrice said politely, though in truth, the house reminded her of the illustrations in the Gothic novels she had secretly devoured as a girl. The carriage pulled to a stop before the main entrance, and Mr. Simmons alighted first, offering his hand to help Beatrice down. The front doors opened as they approached, and a distinguished older man stepped forward. "Welcome to Kenswick Manor, Miss Zephyr," he said with a formal bow. "I am Richardson, the butler. His Grace has asked that you be shown to your quarters immediately to refresh yourself. Dinner will be served at 8. "Thank you, Richardson," Beatrice replied, following him into the grand entrance hall. The interior of Kenswick Manor was indeed less forbidding than its exterior, though no less impressive. The entrance hall rose 3 stories to a domed ceiling painted with classical scenes. Marble columns supported a gallery that ran around the 2nd floor, and a grand staircase swept upward in a graceful curve. "This way, if you please," Richardson said, leading her up the stairs. They traversed several corridors before stopping at a door on the east wing of the house. "These are your quarters, Miss Zephyr. Lady Sophia's rooms adjoin yours through that door." He indicated a door on the far wall of the sitting room they had entered. "His Grace thought it prudent for you to be near her, should she need you during the night." Beatrice nodded, taking in the comfortable sitting room with its cheerful fire and the bedroom visible beyond. The rooms were far more luxurious than any governess quarters she had previously occupied. "His Grace is most generous," she said. "Indeed." Richardson's expression remained impassive. "Your trunks will be brought up shortly. A maid will attend you before dinner. His Grace has requested that you join him in the blue drawing-room at 7:30. He wishes to speak with you before you meet Lady Sophia tomorrow." "Thank you, Richardson." Once alone, Beatrice sank onto a chair by the fire, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. A week ago, she had been contemplating how to make her dwindling funds stretch until she found new employment. Now she was governess in a duke's household, with rooms finer than those she had occupied even in her father's home before the fire. Her father, the familiar ache settled in her chest at the thought of him. Professor Henry Zephyr had been a scholar of some renown, though his progressive views had often put him at odds with his more conservative colleagues. He had raised Beatrice alone after her mother's death in childbirth, encouraging her intellectual pursuits in a way that was unusual for young women of her station. The fire that claimed him had also destroyed Beatrice's future. With their home and her father's modest savings gone, she had been forced to rely on the grudging charity of distant relatives before securing a position as a governess, the only respectable employment available to a gentlewoman of limited means. Her scars had made even that difficult, as many employers were reluctant to expose their children to her disturbing appearance. A knock at the door roused her from her melancholy reflections. A young maid entered, curtsying nervously. "Begging your pardon, miss. I'm Jenny, sent to help you dress for dinner." "Thank you, Jenny," Beatrice smiled, hoping to put the girl at ease. Jenny, however, seemed unable to look directly at her, her gaze skittering away whenever it neared Beatrice's scarred face. "Your trunks have been brought up, miss. Shall I unpack them for you?" "That's kind of you, but I prefer to arrange my own things," Beatrice replied. Years of experience had taught her that her personal belongings were often subject to unwelcome curiosity. "If you could just help me change my gown for dinner, that would be most appreciated." The maid assisted her in changing from her travel-worn dress into her best gown, a dark blue silk that had belonged to her mother and had been carefully altered to fit her. It was several years out of fashion, but it was the finest thing she owned. "Would you like me to do something with your hair, miss?" Jenny asked tentatively. Beatrice hesitated. She typically wore her hair pulled back severely, the better to draw attention away from her face, but perhaps tonight called for a more formal arrangement. "Yes, thank you, Jenny." The maid's nimble fingers soon had Beatrice's rich chestnut hair arranged in a simple but elegant style, with a few soft curls framing her face. "There you are, miss," Jenny said, stepping back to survey her work. For the first time she looked directly at Beatrice, and something like sympathy flickered across her young face. "If I may say so, miss, you have beautiful hair." "Thank you, Jenny," Beatrice said, touched by the simple kindness. At precisely 7:30, Beatrice made her way to the blue drawing-room, following Richardson's careful directions. Her heart pounded with nervous anticipation. Despite his assurances that her scars were of no consequence, she could not help but wonder if the Duke might have second thoughts upon further reflection. The blue drawing-room was a large, elegant chamber on the ground floor, its walls covered in pale blue silk damask. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the richly appointed furnishings. The Duke stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, his tall figure outlined by the flames behind him. "Miss Zephyr," he said, turning as Richardson announced her. "I trust your journey was not too taxing." "Not at all, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, curtsying. Thank you for your consideration in sending Mr. Simmons to accompany me." The Duke nodded, his sharp eyes taking in her appearance. Beatrice fought the urge to turn her scarred cheek away from his gaze. "Would you care for sherry before dinner?" he asked, gesturing to a silver tray bearing crystal decanters. "Thank you, Your Grace." He poured 2 glasses, handing one to her before indicating that she should take a seat on one of the blue brocade sofas. To her surprise, rather than sitting across from her, he settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough for private conversation. "I wish to speak with you about Sophia before you meet her tomorrow," he said, his deep voice pitched low. "As I mentioned in London, she has not spoken since her parents' death. The physicians can find no physical cause. They believe it to be a response to the trauma she witnessed. Such reactions are not uncommon in children who have experienced profound shock," Beatrice said. "Often, the voice returns once the child feels safe again." "She is safe," the Duke said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "I have ensured it." "Of course, Your Grace, I meant no criticism," Beatrice hastened to add. "But a child's sense of safety is complex. It's not merely physical protection, but emotional security as well." The Duke's expression softened slightly. "You speak as one with experience in such matters." "I have worked with children who have suffered loss before," Beatrice said carefully, avoiding the more personal experience that informed her understanding. "And how did you approach them?" "With patience and consistency. Children need to know what to expect, especially when so much in their world has proven unpredictable. Regular routines, clear expectations, and gentle encouragement can help restore their sense of security." The Duke nodded thoughtfully. "And what of Sophia's muteness? Should it be addressed directly or ignored in hopes that she will speak when ready?" "Neither, in my experience," Beatrice replied. "Acknowledging it as a temporary state while providing alternative means of communication often helps. Perhaps she could write her thoughts or use some other form of expression, drawing, music, until she is ready to speak again." For a moment, the Duke studied her with an intensity that made her skin warm beneath his gaze. "You have given this considerable thought," he observed. "I believe every child deserves to be understood, Your Grace," Beatrice said simply. "Indeed." He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "There is another matter we should discuss before dinner. My sister, Sophia's mother, was Lady Catherine Young. She married the Viscount Elmsworth, who was, by all accounts, a devoted husband and father." "I am sorry for your loss, Your Grace," Beatrice said softly, noting the subtle tension in his jaw as he spoke of his sister. "Thank you," he set his glass down with a deliberate motion. "The point I wish to make is that Sophia comes from one of the oldest families in England, despite her current difficulties. She is a child of considerable standing, and will one day move in the highest circles of society." "I understand, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her heart sinking slightly as she anticipated his next words, some variant of the caution that her scars must not unduly influence or disturb the child. Instead, the Duke surprised her. "Then you understand that her education must be exceptional. I will accept nothing less than excellence in her preparation for the role she will eventually assume." "Of course, Your Grace. I assure you I am well qualified to provide such instruction." "I am aware of your qualifications, Miss Zephyr. I would not have hired you otherwise." His tone was matter of fact, without condescension. "What concerns me is Sophia's state of mind. She is resistant to authority at present." "Grief often manifests as anger in children," Beatrice observed. "So I've been told. Nevertheless, while I expect you to be firm, I also expect you to be kind. Sophia has suffered enough." There was something in his voice, a roughness that spoke of personal pain, that caught Beatrice's attention. "May I ask, Your Grace, how long Lady Sophia has been in your care?" "Since the accident 6 months ago. I was named her guardian in my sister's will." He rose abruptly and moved to the fireplace, presenting her with his back. "I had seen little of her before that. My duties kept me occupied elsewhere." "It must be a significant adjustment for you both," Beatrice ventured. The Duke turned, his expression carefully controlled. "Indeed, which is why I have engaged your services, Miss Zephyr. I am ill-equipped to provide the nurturing guidance a young girl requires." Before Beatrice could respond, Richardson appeared at the door. "Dinner is served, Your Grace." "Thank you, Richardson." The Duke offered his arm to Beatrice, a gesture that startled her. It was not customary for employers to escort their governesses to dinner. "Shall we?" Cautiously, Beatrice placed her gloved hand on his arm, acutely aware of the firm muscle beneath the fine fabric of his evening coat. As they walked to the dining room, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the servants they passed. Clearly, the Duke's courteous treatment of a mere governess was unusual. The dining room was cavernous, with a table that could easily seat 30. Only 2 places were set, one at the head and another to the right. Beatrice hesitated, uncertain of protocol in such an intimate dining arrangement with her employer. "We are informal when there are no guests," the Duke explained, seeming to sense her discomfort as he guided her to her seat. "I see little point in shouting across 20 feet of mahogany when dining alone." "Of course, Your Grace," Beatrice murmured, settling into the chair a footman held for her. Dinner was an elaborate affair, despite the informality the Duke had mentioned. 5 courses were served by silent, efficient footmen, accompanied by wines Beatrice suspected cost more than her annual salary. Throughout the meal, the Duke questioned her about her educational philosophies and teaching methods, listening with genuine interest to her responses. "You mentioned you were once an instructor at Mrs. Thistlethwaite's academy," he said as dessert was served. "Why did you leave for a position as a governess?" Beatrice tensed. This was dangerous territory. After my accident, I found the environment at the academy less conducive to teaching, she said carefully. "You mean they dismissed you because of your scars?" the Duke stated bluntly. Beatrice's spoon clattered against her dish. "Not directly, Your Grace. There were concerns from parents." The Duke's expression darkened, unconscionable. "It was understandable," Beatrice said, surprising herself by defending those who had caused her such pain. "Parents entrust their daughters to such institutions with certain expectations. That their children will be educated by competent teachers, not judged by arbitrary standards of beauty," the Duke countered. "The world is not always fair, Your Grace," Beatrice said softly. "No," he agreed, his blue eyes intent upon her face, "but it should be." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Beatrice searched for a neutral topic. "Might I ask about Lady Sophia's previous education? It would help me to know what ground has already been covered." The Duke seemed relieved by the change of subject. "Her previous governess reported that she is advanced in reading and has a natural aptitude for languages. Her mathematical skills are less developed, and she shows little interest in drawing or needlework. And music. She plays the pianoforte tolerably well for her age, but has shown no exceptional talent or interest. Sometimes children's interests develop later with proper encouragement," Beatrice observed. "What does Lady Sophia enjoy?" For the first time, the Duke seemed uncertain. "I am not entirely sure. She spends much time in the gardens when weather permits and in the library during inclement weather." It struck Beatrice as profoundly sad that this man knew so little about the child in his care. Yet she could not judge him harshly. He was clearly trying to do right by his niece, despite his admitted lack of experience with children. "I look forward to discovering her interests," Beatrice said gently. "Children often reveal themselves through what captures their attention." The Duke nodded, then signaled to Richardson. "We'll take coffee in the drawing room." Once again offering his arm, he escorted Beatrice back to the blue drawing room, where coffee was served in delicate porcelain cups. The Duke seemed lost in thought, staring into the fire as he sipped his coffee. "If I may ask, Your Grace," Beatrice ventured, "what is Lady Sophia's daily routine at present? I should like to maintain as much consistency as possible while introducing our lessons." The Duke glanced up, seeming almost relieved by her practical question. "She rises at 7, takes breakfast in her room at past, and then typically spends the morning with her nurse, Mrs. Wilson. The afternoons have been less structured since her last governess departed. She dines in the nursery at 6 and retires at 8. "And does she see you during the day?" Beatrice asked, then immediately regretted her boldness. The Duke's expression tightened. "I look in on her when my duties permit, typically before she retires for the evening." "Forgive my presumption, your grace," Beatrice said quickly. "I only asked to better understand her daily interactions." For a moment she feared she had overstepped irreparably. Then the Duke sighed, setting down his cup with a soft clink. "No, Miss Zephyr, your question is pertinent. I am aware that my involvement in Sophia's life has been minimal. I have no experience with children, and I confess I find myself at a loss as to how to comfort a grieving child when I can barely manage my own grief for my sister." The raw honesty of his admission caught Beatrice off guard. This was not the cold, authoritative Duke she had met in London, but a man struggling with responsibilities he had never anticipated. "Grief has no timetable, your grace," she said quietly. "And children are often more perceptive than we give them credit for. Perhaps Lady Sophia senses your pain and is trying, in her own way, to protect you from hers." The Duke looked at her sharply, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "An interesting theory. Merely an observation from past experience," Beatrice said. "You speak from personal knowledge of grief, I think," he said, his tone gentler than she had yet heard from him. "We all have our burdens to bear, your grace," Beatrice replied, unwilling to expose her own wounds further. The Duke seemed about to press the point, then appeared to think better of it. "Indeed. Well, it grows late, and you must be tired from your journey. I shall see you at breakfast tomorrow, and afterward I will introduce you to Sophia." "Thank you, your grace," Beatrice said, rising and curtsying. "Good night." As she made her way back to her quarters, guided by Richardson, Beatrice found herself puzzling over the complex man who was now her employer. The Duke of Kenswick was clearly a man of contradictions, at once authoritative and uncertain, formal and unexpectedly candid. And beneath his controlled exterior, she sensed a deep well of unexpressed emotion. It would be dangerous to dwell on such observations, she reminded herself firmly. She was here to educate Lady Sophia, not to develop an inappropriate interest in her employer. Yet as she prepared for bed, she could not entirely dismiss the image of those piercing blue eyes studying her with unexpected empathy. Tomorrow she would meet Lady Sophia, and the real work would begin. That at least was familiar territory, a child in need of guidance, education, and understanding. Whatever complexities the Duke presented, Beatrice was determined to focus solely on her duties as governess. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, it was the Duke's voice she heard in her mind, speaking words that had touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. "The world is not always fair, but it should be." Beatrice woke early the next morning, anxiety fluttering in her stomach at the prospect of meeting her new charge. First impressions were crucial with children, especially one as traumatized as Lady Sophia appeared to be. After dressing in a simple grey gown, one of 3 nearly identical dresses that comprised her working wardrobe, she made her way downstairs, following Richardson's directions to the breakfast room. She had expected to dine alone or perhaps with the other senior staff, so she was startled to find the Duke already seated at the table, a newspaper spread before him. "Miss Zephyr," he said, rising briefly as she entered. "Good morning." "Good morning, your grace," she replied, hesitating at the threshold. "I apologize if I have interrupted your breakfast." "Not at all, please join me." He indicated the place setting across from him. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Beatrice said, taking her seat with some trepidation. It was unusual for a governess to dine with the master of the house, and she could sense the subtle surprise of the footmen serving them. The Duke, however, seemed perfectly at ease, returning to his newspaper as a footman served Beatrice from the silver chafing dishes on the sideboard. She ate quietly, not wishing to disturb him, though she couldn't help sneaking occasional glances at his imposing figure. In the morning light, she noticed details she had missed the previous evening: the slight crease between his brows that suggested habitual concentration, the strong line of his jaw that hinted at determination, perhaps even stubbornness. He was clean-shaven, his cravat impeccably tied, every inch the aristocrat, and yet there was something about him that seemed almost restless, as if all this perfection was a shell containing a far more complex interior. "You're staring, Miss Zephyr," the Duke said without looking up from his paper. Heat flooded Beatrice's cheeks. "I beg your pardon, your grace, I was merely lost in thought." He folded the newspaper and set it aside, fixing her with that direct blue gaze. "And what thoughts occupy you this morning?" "I was considering how best to approach Lady Sophia," Beatrice said quickly, offering a partial truth. "First meetings can set the tone for the entire relationship between governess and pupil." "And what have you decided?" "That I shall be honest with her," Beatrice replied. "Children have an uncanny ability to detect insincerity. I will not pretend that I can replace what she has lost, nor will I ignore her grief, but I will offer her structure, consistency, and a chance to express herself in whatever way she can." The Duke nodded slowly. "A sensible approach." He hesitated, then added, "There is something you should know about Sophia before you meet her." "Yes, Your Grace." "She may be distressed by your scars, at least initially." He spoke carefully, as if navigating treacherous waters. "Not out of any cruelty or prejudice, but because they remind her of her own experience." Beatrice tensed. "I don't understand." "The carriage accident that killed my sister and brother-in-law involved fire," the Duke explained, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Sophia witnessed it. She tried to reach her parents but was held back by a passerby who saved her life. She has been sensitive to any reminders of that day." Understanding dawned, along with a surge of compassion for the child. "I see," Beatrice said softly. "Thank you for telling me, Your Grace. I will be mindful of her sensitivity." "I do not tell you this to suggest you should hide your scars or apologize for them," the Duke said firmly, "merely to prepare you for her possible reaction." "Of course," Beatrice hesitated, then asked, "Does Lady Sophia have any physical reminders of the accident herself?" "Minor scarring on her left arm where she was thrown from the carriage," the Duke replied. "The physicians say it will fade with time." Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps our shared experience, though different in degree, might eventually provide a point of connection rather than division. "An optimistic view," the Duke observed. "Children are remarkably adaptable, Your Grace, more so than adults in many cases." A faint smile touched the Duke's lips. "You speak from experience, I think." "I've worked with many children," Beatrice said, evading the personal implication. "So you have," the Duke checked his pocket watch. "Sophia should be finishing her breakfast now. Shall we go to her?" Beatrice's heart quickened. "Of course, Your Grace." They walked in silence through the grand corridors of Kenswick Manor, climbing to the nursery floor on the third level of the East Wing. The Duke moved with long, confident strides that Beatrice struggled to match without appearing undignified. "One moment, Miss Zephyr," the Duke said, as they neared what she presumed was the nursery door. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I should warn you that Sophia can be challenging. Her silence is but one aspect of her response to grief. She has developed a habit of testing boundaries, of pushing away those who attempt to care for her. That's not uncommon in children who have experienced sudden loss," Beatrice assured him. "They often fear forming new attachments, lest those too be taken from them." "You understand much about grief for one so young," the Duke observed, studying her face with disconcerting intensity. "As you noted yesterday, Your Grace, I speak from experience," Beatrice said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or empathy. "Then perhaps you are precisely what Sophia needs." He paused, then added, "What we both need." Before Beatrice could process this unexpected statement, the Duke knocked on the nursery door and entered without waiting for a response. The nursery was a large, airy room with tall windows overlooking the estate's formal gardens. It was well appointed with child-sized furniture, bookshelves filled with volumes, and a corner dedicated to dolls and other toys that appeared untouched. A middle-aged woman in a neat grey dress rose from a chair by the fire. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying, "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "Mrs. Wilson," the Duke acknowledged with a nod. "I've come to introduce Miss Zephyr, Sophia's new governess." Mrs. Wilson turned to Beatrice, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of her scars before she recovered her composure. "Miss Zephyr, welcome to Kenswick Manor." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Beatrice replied warmly. "I look forward to working with you for Lady Sophia's benefit." "And where is my niece this morning?" the Duke inquired, glancing around the empty nursery. "In her bedchamber, Your Grace, Mrs. Wilson replied with a slight grimace. She refused to dress properly this morning and has barricaded herself inside. The Duke's jaw tightened. I see. How long has this been going on? Since breakfast, Your Grace. Almost an hour now. Miss Zephyr, the Duke said, turning to Beatrice, perhaps you would care to make your first attempt at managing my niece's willfulness. Beatrice hesitated, aware that this was a test, not only of her authority with the child, but of her methods in the Duke's eyes. I should be happy to speak with Lady Sophia, Your Grace, she said carefully. Though perhaps it would be best if I did so alone. Children often respond differently when they do not feel they have an audience. The Duke considered her for a moment, then nodded. Very well, Mrs. Wilson will show you to Sophia's room. I shall await your report in my study in 1 hour. After the Duke departed, Mrs. Wilson gave Beatrice a sympathetic look. I wish you luck, Miss Zephyr. Lady Sophia has become increasingly difficult since the last governess left. How long ago was that? Beatrice asked. Nearly a month now. The poor woman lasted barely 6 weeks before she gave her notice, said she couldn't bear the silent treatment a moment longer. Mrs. Wilson shook her head sadly. It breaks my heart to see the child so changed. Before the accident, she was the sweetest little girl, always laughing, always chattering. Grief affects us all differently, Beatrice said gently. May I ask, does Lady Sophia have any particular interests or comforts, favorite books or activities? She used to love her dolls and her picture books, Mrs. Wilson replied, leading Beatrice to a door at the far end of the nursery. Now she spends hours just staring out the window or hiding in the library. The only thing that seems to bring her any peace is her mother's locket. She wears it always and becomes most distressed if anyone tries to remove it. Thank you for telling me, Beatrice said. That's helpful information. They stopped before a white-painted door. This is Lady Sophia's bedchamber, Mrs. Wilson said, lowering her voice. She's pushed a chair against the door, but I doubt she'll have secured it well. I'll manage from here, Beatrice assured her. Perhaps you could give us some time alone. Mrs. Wilson nodded, though she looked doubtful. I'll be in the nursery if you need me. Once the nurse had withdrawn, Beatrice took a deep breath and knocked gently on the door. Lady Sophia, my name is Miss Zephyr. I'm your new governess. Silence answered her. I understand you might not feel like talking to me right now, and that's perfectly all right, Beatrice continued, keeping her voice calm and matter-of-fact. I simply wanted to introduce myself and perhaps read a story together if you'd like. Still no response. Beatrice considered her options. She could assert her authority immediately, demanding the child open the door, but that would likely only reinforce the barrier between them. Instead, she decided on a different approach. I'll sit right here outside your door and read aloud if you don't mind, she said, settling herself on the floor with her back against the wall beside the door. From her pocket, she withdrew a small, worn volume of fairy tales, one of the few personal possessions she had brought with her. This book belonged to me when I was about your age, she said, opening to a familiar story. My father used to read these tales to me every night before bed. This one is about a princess who couldn't or wouldn't speak. She began reading in a clear, expressive voice, not too loud but easily audible through the door. The story told of a princess who had made a promise never to speak until she could say something that would bring true happiness. After many adventures and trials, she discovered that sometimes the simplest words, "I understand your pain," were the most powerful of all. Beatrice was halfway through the tale when she heard a faint sound from behind the door, the scrape of a chair being moved. She continued reading without pause, pretending not to notice even when the door cracked open an inch, revealing a slice of a small, pale face peering out at her. Only when she had finished the story did Beatrice look up, meeting the wary gaze of Lady Sophia Young. The child was small for 7, with dark hair that hung in tangled curls around a thin face dominated by enormous blue eyes, the same striking shade as her uncle's. She wore only her nightgown, though it was well past the hour when a young lady should be dressed for the day. "Hello, Lady Sophia," Beatrice said gently. "Thank you for listening to my story." The child made no sound, but her eyes widened as they fixed on Beatrice's scarred cheek. Rather than flinching or pretending not to notice, Beatrice addressed it directly. "Yes, I have scars on my face and hands," she said matter-of-factly. "I was in a fire some years ago. I understand you were in an accident too, and have a scar on your arm." Sophia's hand moved unconsciously to her left forearm, where Beatrice presumed the scar was hidden beneath her nightgown sleeve. "Scars remind us that we have survived something difficult," Beatrice continued. "They can be uncomfortable for others to see sometimes, but they are part of our story." The child continued to stare, but something in her expression had shifted from wariness to cautious curiosity. "I have an idea," Beatrice said, rising slowly to her feet. "Since we both have stories we may not wish to tell yet, perhaps we could start with something simpler. Would you show me your favorite book?" For a long moment, Sophia remained motionless. Then, to Beatrice's surprise, she turned and disappeared back into her room, leaving the door ajar, an implicit invitation. Beatrice followed cautiously, entering a charming bedchamber decorated in soft blues and creams. The bed was unmade, the wardrobe doors flung open with dresses strewn about, clear evidence of the child's earlier refusal to dress. Sophia stood by a small bookshelf, running her finger along the spines until she found what she sought. She pulled out a volume and brought it to Beatrice, her face still expressionless but her actions deliberate. "The Secret Garden," Beatrice read from the cover. "That's one of my favorites as well. Would you like me to read some of it to you?" Sophia gave a tiny nod, the first direct response Beatrice had received. "I'd be delighted to," Beatrice said, careful not to overreact to this small victory. "But first, I think we should get you dressed for the day. Would you like to choose your own dress, or would you prefer I select one for you?" Sophia hesitated, then moved to the scattered garments, selecting a simple blue frock that matched her eyes. She held it up questioningly. "An excellent choice," Beatrice approved. "Would you like my help, or would you prefer to dress yourself?" The child clutched the dress to her chest, her expression suddenly guarded again. "You can dress yourself," Beatrice said quickly, understanding the child's need for independence. "I'll wait in the nursery with your book, and we can read together when you're ready." Relief flickered across Sophia's face, and she nodded again. "Take your time," Beatrice said, moving toward the door. "There's no rush this morning." In the nursery, she found Mrs. Wilson waiting anxiously. "She opened the door for you?" the nurse asked incredulously. "We've made a small beginning," Beatrice replied, unwilling to overstate the fragile connection. "Lady Sophia is dressing herself now, and then we'll read together." "Well, I never," Mrs. Wilson muttered, shaking her head in wonder. "The last governess couldn't get her to acknowledge her existence for 3 days." "Children respond to different approaches," Beatrice said diplomatically. "Lady Sophia and I simply found common ground." Before Mrs. Wilson could question her further, Sophia appeared in the doorway, neatly dressed in the blue frock, though her hair remained unbrushed. Around her neck hung a delicate gold locket, the keepsake of her mother that Mrs. Wilson had mentioned. "There you are, my lady," Beatrice said warmly. "Shall we read together now?" Sophia padded across the room in her stockinged feet and climbed onto a window seat that overlooked the gardens. She patted the space beside her, a clear invitation. "If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Wilson," Beatrice said, moving to join the child. "Perhaps you could bring us some tea in an hour." "Of course, Miss Zephyr," the nurse replied, clearly astonished by this turn of events. For the next hour, Beatrice read from The Secret Garden, pausing occasionally to ask simple questions that Sophia could answer with a nod or shake of her head. The child remained mute, but she listened intently, her small body gradually relaxing as the story progressed. When Mrs. Wilson returned with tea and small cakes, Beatrice gently closed the book. "We'll continue tomorrow, shall we? For now, perhaps we might have our tea and then brush your hair." To her surprise, Sophia reached out and touched Beatrice's own neatly coiled hair, a question in her eyes. "Would you like your hair arranged like mine?" Beatrice asked, understanding the silent query. Sophia nodded eagerly. "I'd be happy to style it for you after we have our tea," Beatrice promised. As they shared their simple repast, Beatrice felt a cautious optimism. The child was clearly capable of communication, even without words. The challenge would be to build on this tentative connection, to establish trust and routine, and perhaps, eventually, to help Sophia find her voice again. Later, as she reported to the Duke in his study, Beatrice was careful not to overstate the morning's modest success. She allowed me to read to her and responded to simple questions with gestures, she explained. It's a beginning, nothing more. The Duke, seated behind his massive desk, regarded her thoughtfully. Mrs. Wilson tells me Sophia has shown more engagement with you in one morning than she did with her previous governess in 6 weeks. Beatrice felt her cheeks warm at the implied praise. Lady Sophia is an intelligent child. I believe she responds to being treated as such, rather than as an object of pity or frustration. And the matter of your scars, did they distress her? She noticed them, certainly, Beatrice replied. I acknowledged them directly and suggested that scars tell our stories. She seemed to understand the concept. Remarkable, the Duke murmured. You have a gift for communication, Miss Zephyr, even with those who cannot or will not speak. Thank you, Your Grace. But I must caution against expecting too much too soon. Lady Sophia has experienced profound trauma. Her healing will take time and will likely include setbacks. I am well aware of the unpredictable nature of grief, Miss Zephyr, the Duke said, a shadow crossing his features. I ask only that you continue as you have begun and keep me informed of her progress, or lack thereof. Of course, Your Grace, Beatrice hesitated, then ventured a suggestion. If I may, it might be beneficial for Lady Sophia to see you more regularly. Children find comfort in routine, especially regarding the adults in their lives. The Duke frowned slightly. I see her every evening before she retires. Yes, Your Grace, but perhaps a more interactive engagement, reading with her or walking in the gardens, something that allows for communication, however limited. For a moment, Beatrice feared she had overstepped. The Duke's expression remained inscrutable as he regarded her across the expanse of his desk. Then, to her relief, he nodded slowly. Your suggestion has merit, he conceded. I confess I have been uncertain how to engage with a child who does not speak. Perhaps you could advise me on appropriate activities. I would be honored, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, touched by his willingness to seek her guidance. Perhaps you might join us for tea in the nursery tomorrow afternoon. Lady Sophia showed interest in The Secret Garden. You could continue the reading where I leave off. The Secret Garden, the Duke repeated, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Catherine, my sister, loved that book as a child. She must have given it to Sophia. It's a story about healing and renewal, Beatrice said softly. Perhaps Lady Sophia finds comfort in it for that reason. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes intent. You understand much about the human heart, Miss Zephyr. I merely observe, Your Grace, Beatrice demurred, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. Then you observe keenly. He rose, signaling the end of their meeting. I shall join you and Sophia for tea tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We shall look forward to it, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, rising and curtsying before taking her leave. As she returned to the nursery, Beatrice found herself unexpectedly moved by the Duke's willingness to attempt a deeper connection with his niece. Behind his formidable exterior, there appeared to be a man genuinely concerned for the welfare of the child in his care, if somewhat at a loss as to how to express it. Sophia was waiting for her, still perched on the window seat with The Secret Garden open on her lap. Though the child did not smile, Beatrice suspected she had not smiled since the accident. There was a tentative acceptance in her demeanor that gave Beatrice hope. Shall we continue our reading, Lady Sophia? She asked, settling beside the child. And afterward, perhaps we might try a simple drawing lesson. I think you might enjoy sketching some of the flowers from the garden. Sophia tilted her head, considering, then nodded. It was a small beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And in that moment, Beatrice allowed herself to hope that perhaps, in helping this wounded child, she might find some healing for her own scars as well. Over the next fortnight, a routine began to establish itself at Kenswick Manor. Each morning, Beatrice and Sophia engaged in lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic, and French, with Sophia communicating through nods, shakes of her head, or written responses. Afternoons were devoted to drawing, music, or walks in the vast gardens when weather permitted. To Beatrice's surprise, The Duke joined them for tea nearly every day, not just the once she had suggested. Though somewhat stiff and formal at first, he gradually became more at ease in his niece's presence, particularly when continuing the reading of The Secret Garden, where Beatrice left off. His deep voice gave the story a different quality, and Beatrice often found herself as captivated as Sophia by his reading. More surprising still was Sophia's response to her uncle's increased presence. The child began to anticipate his arrival, watching the nursery clock as 4 o'clock approached and positioning herself by the door a few minutes before he was due. Though she still did not speak, she had begun to communicate more freely with both Beatrice and the Duke through gestures and written notes. On the afternoon of Beatrice's 15th day at Kenswick Manor, she and Sophia were in the gardens, sketching the late summer roses, when they were interrupted by the arrival of a carriage on the main drive. "It seems we have visitors," Beatrice observed, watching as the elegant barouche drew to a halt before the main entrance. "Perhaps friends of your uncle." Sophia shrugged, clearly uninterested in the newcomers, and returned to her drawing. But Beatrice's attention remained on the carriage as 3 ladies descended, their elaborate gowns and haughty bearing marking them as members of the aristocracy. She felt a strange unease as Richardson appeared to welcome them. The Duke had mentioned no expected guests. "Let's continue our drawing for now," she said to Sophia, pushing aside her disquiet. "Those roses won't stay in bloom forever." They remained in the garden for another hour, until the lengthening shadows and cooling air suggested it was time to return indoors. As they approached the manor, Beatrice was surprised to see the Duke himself coming to meet them, his expression grave. "Miss Zephyr," he said formally, "Lady Sophia, I trust your afternoon has been productive." "Indeed, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, curtsying. "Lady Sophia has made remarkable progress with her botanical sketches." Sophia held up her drawing pad, showing her uncle a credible rendition of a damask rose. "Most impressive," the Duke said, his expression softening as he regarded his niece. "You have your mother's talent for drawing, it seems." A fleeting shadow crossed Sophia's face at the mention of her mother, but she did not retreat into the complete withdrawal that had characterized her early days with Beatrice. "Sophia," the Duke continued, kneeling to her level, an unprecedented informality that startled Beatrice, "we have visitors who are eager to see you. My cousin, Lady Harrington, and her daughters have come to stay for a few days." Beatrice felt as if the ground had dropped from beneath her feet. Lady Harrington, her former employer, who had dismissed her because her scars might frighten the children. And now the woman was here, in what Beatrice had begun to think of as a safe haven. Sophia was tugging at the Duke's sleeve, her expression questioning. "Yes, you remember them," he assured her. "You met them at Christmas 2 years ago. Miss Charlotte is 12 now, and Miss Emma is 10. I thought you might enjoy some companionship from girls nearer your age." Sophia's response was difficult to interpret, a shrug that might have indicated either acceptance or indifference. "Miss Zephyr," the Duke said, rising to his full height, "I must apologize for not warning you of our visitors. The invitation was extended some time ago, but I had not expected them to accept." "There is no need for apology, Your Grace," Beatrice said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Lady Sophia and I will adjust our schedule as needed to accommodate your guests." The Duke hesitated, then said in a lower voice, "I am aware that Lady Harrington was previously your employer. If her presence causes you any discomfort—" "It does not, Your Grace," Beatrice interrupted, unwilling to admit the panic that was rapidly building within her. "I am quite capable of maintaining professional composure." "Of course," he said, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he saw more than she wished to reveal. "Nevertheless, I have instructed the staff that Lady Sophia's routines are to continue with minimal disruption. Your authority in matters concerning her education and welfare remains absolute." Beatrice was touched by his consideration. "Thank you, Your Grace, that is most reassuring. I have also taken the liberty of having dinner served in your rooms this evening," he continued. "I thought you and Sophia might prefer a quiet meal after a day of lessons, rather than joining us in the dining room." Though phrased as consideration for their comfort, Beatrice recognized it for what it was, an attempt to spare her the immediate discomfort of facing Lady Harrington across the dinner table. She was both grateful for his tact and humiliated by the necessity for it. "That is most thoughtful, Your Grace," she murmured. "Uncle," Sophia tugged at his sleeve again, her small face serious as she held up her drawing pad. She had written a message in her careful hand. "Will you still come for tea tomorrow?" The Duke's expression softened as he read the note. "Of course, Sophia, 4 o'clock as always. Nothing is more important than our reading time." The child nodded, apparently satisfied, and slipped her small hand into Beatrice's, a gesture of trust that never failed to move her. "We should prepare for dinner," Beatrice said gently, "and perhaps select a special passage for your uncle to read tomorrow." As they made their way back to the East Wing, Beatrice tried to quell the anxiety churning in her stomach. Lady Harrington's presence was an unwelcome reminder of the world beyond Kenswick Manor, a world that judged her solely by her scars rather than her abilities or character. For the past fortnight, she had almost forgotten how the rest of society saw her. The Duke treated her with a respect bordering on deference, while Sophia had accepted her scars as simply part of who she was. Even the servants, initially wary, had grown to treat her with genuine courtesy. Now Lady Harrington would remind everyone that Beatrice Zephyr was an object of pity at best, revulsion at worst. And despite the Duke's assurances, Beatrice knew that the aristocratic codes of behavior would ultimately prevail. A duke could hardly snub his cousin in favor of his niece's governess. That evening, as she and Sophia dined quietly in Beatrice's sitting room, she tried to focus on the child's needs rather than her own apprehension. Sophia seemed unconcerned about the visitors, more interested in showing Beatrice a book of pressed flowers she had found in the library that afternoon. "These are beautifully preserved," Beatrice commented, examining the delicate specimens. "Perhaps we could create our own collection from the gardens before autumn comes." Sophia nodded eagerly, then wrote on her slate, "Can we show Uncle Kenneth?" Beatrice smiled at the child's use of the Duke's given name, a recent development that suggested increasing comfort with her guardian. "Of course we can. I'm sure he would be fascinated by your botanical knowledge." After dinner, as Beatrice was preparing Sophia for bed, a knock came at the door connecting their rooms. Jenny, the young maid who attended them, entered with an envelope on a silver tray. "For you, Miss Zephyr," she said, curtsying, "from His Grace." Beatrice opened the note with a flicker of trepidation, unsure what new complication might have arisen. Inside was a brief message in a bold, masculine hand. "Miss Zephyr, I regret to inform you that Lady Harrington has expressed a desire to observe Sophia's lessons tomorrow morning. While I have emphasized that decisions regarding Sophia's education rest with you, I could not reasonably deny the request from a family member with Sophia's interests at heart. Please know that you have my complete confidence and support. Should you require anything to ensure Sophia's comfort during this visit, you need only ask." KY Beatrice read the note twice, her heart sinking further with each reading. Lady Harrington's observation would undoubtedly be an assessment of Beatrice's fitness to educate a child of Sophia's standing, particularly given her previous decision that Beatrice's scars made her unsuitable to teach her own daughters. "Is everything all right, Miss Beatrice?" Jenny asked, using the more familiar address that had become customary when they were alone. "Yes, Jenny, it's merely a change to tomorrow's schedule," Beatrice replied, forcing a smile. "Lady Harrington wishes to observe our morning lessons." "Oh," Jenny's expression said more than words could. "Well, if I may say so, Miss, Lady Sophia has come along wonderfully under your care. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Thank you, Jenny," Beatrice said, touched by the girl's loyalty. "That's kind of you to say." After Jenny had gone and Sophia was tucked into bed, Beatrice returned to her own room, the Duke's note still clutched in her hand. She sank into a chair by the fire, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. For 2 weeks, she had allowed herself to believe that she had found a place where her scars did not define her, where her abilities were recognized and valued. Now Lady Harrington's arrival had shattered that illusion. Once again, she would be judged not by her competence but by her appearance. "I will not give her the satisfaction," Beatrice whispered to herself, straightening her spine. "I am more than my scars. And I will prove it." With renewed determination, She began preparing for the morning's lessons, selecting materials that would showcase Sophia's progress while demonstrating her own teaching abilities. Lady Harrington might judge her for her appearance, but she would find no fault with her methods or results. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect late summer day that belied the tension Beatrice felt as she dressed with particular care. She chose her best day dress, a deep plum that was more flattering than her usual grey, and arranged her hair in a neat chignon that partially obscured the scarring on her right temple. Sophia, sensing her governess's unease, was unusually cooperative, dressing quickly and sitting down to breakfast without complaint. As they finished their meal, the child wrote on her slate, "I don't like Lady Harrington. Her daughters are mean." Beatrice bit back a smile at the child's forthright assessment. "We must always be courteous to guests in your uncle's home," she said diplomatically. "But you need not spend more time with them than you wish." Sophia considered this, then wrote, "Will you stay with me?" "Of course," Beatrice promised, touched by the child's concern. "I'm your governess. My place is with you." At precisely 9 o'clock, as Beatrice and Sophia were setting up for their first lesson in the schoolroom, a knock came at the door. Richardson entered, his expression impassive but his eyes sympathetic. "Lady Harrington to observe the morning lessons, Miss Zephyr," he announced. Lady Harrington swept into the room, a vision of fashion in a visiting dress of pale blue silk trimmed with delicate lace. She was a handsome woman of around 40, with the same striking blue eyes as the Duke, a family trait, Beatrice realized, and an air of absolute confidence in her own importance. "Miss Zephyr," she said, her gaze sliding over Beatrice's scarred face with barely disguised distaste. "How unexpected to find you here." "Lady Harrington," Beatrice replied, curtsying. "Welcome to Kenswick Manor." "Lady Sophia," Lady Harrington continued, turning to the child with a brittle smile. "How you've grown since I last saw you, though you're still rather small for your age, aren't you?" Sophia stared at her with undisguised hostility, moving closer to Beatrice's side. "Lady Sophia has been making excellent progress in her studies," Beatrice said, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "Today we are continuing with our French vocabulary and beginning a new chapter in our natural history text." "Indeed," Lady Harrington raised an elegantly plucked eyebrow. "Kenneth mentioned that the child refuses to speak. How does one teach French to a mute pupil?" Beatrice felt Sophia stiffen beneath her hand. "Lady Sophia communicates quite effectively through writing and gestures," she said calmly. "Her comprehension of French is excellent, and her written responses demonstrate a growing vocabulary." "How creative," Lady Harrington murmured, taking a seat at the back of the schoolroom. "Please don't let me interrupt your methods." Ignoring the thinly veiled condescension, Beatrice turned her attention to Sophia. "Shall we begin with our French vocabulary, Lady Sophia? I thought we might focus on terms related to the garden, given your interest in botany." For the next hour, Beatrice conducted the lesson as planned, speaking in clear, simple French and encouraging Sophia to respond by writing her answers on a slate. The child, whether out of loyalty to Beatrice or determination to prove Lady Harrington wrong, applied herself with unusual concentration. As they moved from language to natural history, Beatrice brought out specimens they had collected from the gardens, leaves, flowers, even a preserved butterfly, and guided Sophia through identification and classification. The child's enthusiasm was evident as she carefully labeled each specimen in her notebook. Throughout the lesson, Lady Harrington observed in silence, her expression giving away little. When the morning break came at 11, she rose gracefully from her chair. "Most illuminating, Miss Zephyr," she said. "I wonder if I might have a private word with you before you continue." "Of course, Lady Harrington," Beatrice replied, though dread pooled in her stomach. To Sophia, she said, "Why don't you take your slate to the window seat and practice your Italian verbs while I speak with Lady Harrington? I'll check your work when we resume." Once Sophia was settled across the room, Lady Harrington moved closer to Beatrice, lowering her voice. "I must admit, Miss Zephyr, that I am surprised by your presence here. When I recommended a governess for my cousin's niece, I certainly did not suggest you." "I was not aware that you had made any recommendations, Lady Harrington," Beatrice replied evenly. His Grace engaged me based on my qualifications. Kenneth has always been unconventional in his decisions, Lady Harrington said with a thin smile. However, I must question the wisdom of placing a child who has experienced such trauma in the care of someone whose appearance is a constant reminder of similar horrors. Beatrice struggled to maintain her composure. Lady Sophia does not seem distressed by my appearance. In fact, we have discussed our respective experiences with injury, and I believe it has created a bond of understanding between us. How charming, Lady Harrington said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Nevertheless, I cannot help but wonder if a more suitable governess might better prepare Sophia for her future role in society. The scars of the mind may be invisible, Miss Zephyr, but they can be more damaging than those we can see. With all due respect, Lady Harrington, Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper, Lady Sophia's progress under my care speaks for itself. She is engaging with her studies, communicating more freely, and showing interest in the world around her. His Grace seems satisfied with these developments. Kenneth is a brilliant man in many respects, Lady Harrington conceded, but he knows little of children or their needs. As a mother, I feel it my duty to ensure that Sophia receives the proper guidance during this difficult time. Before Beatrice could respond, the door to the schoolroom opened, and the Duke himself entered. His tall figure seemed to fill the room, and his expression as he took in the tableau before him, Sophia at the window, Beatrice and Lady Harrington in close conversation, was unreadable. "Cousin," Lady Harrington said, her manner instantly softening, "I was just discussing Lady Sophia's education with Miss Zephyr. She has some most unusual methods." "So I gather," the Duke replied, his gaze moving to Beatrice. "And how do you find our Sophia's progress, cousin?" "The child appears to be learning," Lady Harrington admitted reluctantly, "though I must question whether her emotional needs are being adequately addressed. She still refuses to speak, after all. Miss Zephyr has been quite clear that Sophia's silence is a response to trauma that cannot be rushed or forced," the Duke said, his tone brooking no argument. "I have complete confidence in her approach." Lady Harrington's smile tightened. "Of course, Kenneth, I merely thought, as family, I might offer a mother's perspective." "Your concern is noted," the Duke said coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe Sophia and Miss Zephyr have further lessons scheduled." "Actually, Your Grace," Beatrice interjected, "we were about to take a short break. Perhaps Lady Harrington would care to join Lady Sophia for a walk in the gardens. It would give them an opportunity to become better acquainted." Both the Duke and Lady Harrington looked surprised by this suggestion. "What a thoughtful idea," Lady Harrington said after a moment. "Sophia, dear, would you care to show me your favorite flowers?" Sophia glanced at Beatrice, who nodded encouragingly. Though clearly reluctant, the child rose and moved toward the door, maintaining a careful distance from Lady Harrington. "We shall return in half an hour," Lady Harrington promised, following Sophia from the room. Once they were alone, the Duke turned to Beatrice, his expression softening. "You need not have done that, Miss Zephyr. I would have removed her from your classroom without hesitation." "I thought it best for Lady Sophia to have some time with her relatives," Beatrice replied. "Family connections are important, even when they are challenging." The Duke's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "A diplomatic assessment. Tell me honestly, has my cousin made you uncomfortable?" Beatrice hesitated, torn between honesty and discretion. "Lady Harrington has expressed some concerns about my suitability as Lady Sophia's governess," she admitted finally. "Based on your scars," the Duke stated flatly. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duke's expression hardened. "My cousin's preoccupation with appearances is tedious at the best of times, and downright offensive in this instance. Please be assured that her opinions have no bearing on your position here." "Thank you, Your Grace," Beatrice said, deeply touched by his support. "However, I would not wish to be a source of conflict between you and your family." "You are not the source of any conflict, Miss Zephyr," the Duke said firmly. "Agatha's interference is unwelcome but not unexpected. She has always believed she knows what is best for everyone in her orbit." "She cares for Lady Sophia," Beatrice offered, feeling compelled to be fair despite her own hurt feelings. In her way, yes, the Duke conceded. But she does not know Sophia as you do. The child has flourished under your care, Miss Zephyr. I will not jeopardize that progress to satisfy my cousin's notions of propriety. Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Lady Sophia is a remarkable child. It has been a privilege to guide her these past 2 weeks. The privilege has been ours, the Duke said softly, his blue eyes intent on her face. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, something that made Beatrice's heart beat faster before he composed his features once more. Now, I believe I am still expected for tea at 4 o'clock. Of course, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, grateful for the return to safer topics. Lady Sophia has selected a particularly engaging passage for you to read. I look forward to it, he said, inclining his head slightly before taking his leave. Alone in the schoolroom, Beatrice pressed a hand to her cheek, which felt unusually warm. The Duke's support was gratifying, of course, but it was the look in his eyes, a look that seemed to see beyond her scars to the woman beneath, that had unsettled her. She was being fanciful, she told herself sternly. The Duke of Kenswick was simply a decent man who recognized her professional capabilities, nothing more. To imagine otherwise was both foolish and dangerous. She was, after all, only a scarred governess, and he was one of the most powerful men in England. And yet, as she prepared for the afternoon's lessons, Beatrice could not quite dismiss the flutter of something dangerously like hope that had taken root in her heart. The days that followed were a study in contrasts for Beatrice. In the schoolroom with Sophia, she found joy and purpose. The child continued to respond to her methods, communicating more freely through gestures and writing, if not yet speech. Their lessons were productive, their walks in the garden peaceful, their evenings filled with books and quiet companionship. Outside the schoolroom, however, Beatrice felt increasingly isolated. Lady Harrington, though outwardly polite, had made her disapproval clear to the household staff. Subtle changes in their behavior toward Beatrice, averted gazes, conversations that ceased when she entered a room, suggested that the lady's influence was considerable. Even Richardson, who had always treated her with respect, now seemed more formal, less forthcoming. Only Jenny remained genuinely warm, bringing Beatrice small comforts, fresh flowers for her room, an extra blanket when the nights turned cool, that spoke of true kindness. Most painful of all was the reduced frequency of the Duke's visits to the nursery. Where he had joined them for tea nearly every day before Lady Harrington's arrival, he now appeared only every third or fourth day, citing pressing business matters that required his attention. When he did come, he seemed distracted, less engaged with Sophia's progress, though no less kind in his manner. Beatrice told herself it was natural. The Duke had familial obligations to his guests that took precedence over nursery tea. Yet she could not help but wonder if Lady Harrington's influence extended even to him, if she had perhaps planted doubts about Beatrice's suitability that he was too courteous to express directly. A week after Lady Harrington's arrival, as Beatrice was returning from a solitary walk in the gardens, Sophia having been invited to join her cousins for luncheon in the conservatory, she overheard voices from the library. The door stood slightly ajar, and Lady Harrington's carrying tone was unmistakable. Really, Kenneth, I cannot understand your insistence on keeping that scarred woman as Sophia's governess. The child needs normal companions, not a constant reminder of tragedy. Miss Zephyr is highly qualified, Agatha, came the Duke's measured response, and Sophia has made remarkable progress under her care. Progress, Lady Harrington scoffed. The child still doesn't speak. And now she's developing that dreadful habit of writing notes instead of communicating properly. It's most unbecoming in a young lady of her station. Sophia will speak when she is ready, the Duke replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. And until then, I am grateful that Miss Zephyr has found a way for her to express herself. There are dozens of qualified governesses who do not look as if they've escaped from a Gothic novel, Lady Harrington persisted. Miss Trent, for instance, whom I recommended, has an impeccable background and a most pleasing appearance. Sophia would benefit from such a positive example of feminine grace. I am not in the habit of selecting my staff based on their appearance, Agatha, the Duke said coldly. Miss Zephyr's competence and compassion are what matter to me, not the state of her complexion. You cannot be so naive, Kenneth. Lady Harrington's voice dropped to a more intimate tone that made Beatrice strain to hear. People are already talking. A bachelor duke keeping a scarred spinster in his household. It raises eyebrows. What nonsense is this? The duke's voice rose sharply. My dear cousin, you must know that your interest in the governess has been noted. The way you speak of her, the time you spend in the nursery, servants talk, and talk travels. Lady Whitby mentioned it to me just last week at Lady Spencer's soiree. Beatrice felt ill. The idea that her presence was causing gossip about the Duke, that her scarred face was bringing him into disrepute, was unbearable. Lady Whitby should attend to her own affairs rather than inventing scandals about mine, the Duke said, his tone glacial. And you, cousin, should know better than to repeat such malicious drivel. I repeat it only out of concern for you and for Sophia, Lady Harrington protested. The child's future prospects could be damaged by association with inappropriate persons. And your own reputation. My reputation is not so fragile as to be damaged by employing a qualified governess, scarred or otherwise, the Duke interrupted. And this conversation is at an end, Agatha. I will not discuss Miss Zephyr further. As you wish, Kenneth, but when society begins to whisper more loudly, do not say I did not warn you. Unable to bear any more, Beatrice retreated silently down the corridor, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. To be the subject of gossip was humiliating enough. To potentially damage the Duke's reputation, and by extension, Sophia's future prospects, was intolerable. That evening, after Sophia had been put to bed, Beatrice sat at her small writing desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The proper course seemed clear. She should tender her resignation, spare the Duke any further gossip, and seek a position elsewhere. Perhaps in a school again, or in a household less prominent in society. Yet the thought of leaving Sophia tore at her heart. The child had begun to trust her, to respond to her. To abandon her now would be a betrayal of that fragile trust. And the Duke, what would he think if she resigned without explanation? That she was weak, perhaps, or that she had heard the gossip and feared for her own reputation. Foolish woman, she whispered to herself. Your reputation was lost with your beauty 5 years ago. There is nothing left to protect. A soft knock at her door roused her from these bitter reflections. She opened it to find Jenny, bearing a small silver tray with a folded note. From His Grace, Miss Beatrice, the maid said. He asked that it be delivered to you personally. Thank you, Jenny, Beatrice replied, taking the note with trepidation. Once alone, she broke the seal and read the Duke's bold handwriting. Miss Zephyr, I find myself in need of your counsel regarding Sophia's education. Would you do me the honor of joining me in the library at 10 o'clock this evening, after the household has retired? I assure you this unusual request is made with the utmost propriety and solely out of concern for my niece's welfare. If this is inconvenient or in any way makes you uncomfortable, please simply retain this note, and I will understand your silence as a refusal. With respect. K.Y. Beatrice read the note twice, her pulse quickening. A private meeting after hours in the library. It was highly irregular, verging on improper. Yet the Duke's assurance of propriety and the formal tone of the note suggested genuine professional concern rather than any ulterior motive. And she admitted to herself she was curious. What counsel could he possibly need that required such privacy? Perhaps he wished to discuss Lady Harrington's concerns without the woman herself being present. After a moment's hesitation, Beatrice pennied a brief reply. Your Grace. I shall attend you in the library at 10 o'clock as requested. I am, as always, at your service regarding Lady Sophia's welfare. Your obedient servant. B. Zephyr. She gave the note to Jenny with instructions to deliver it to the Duke, then turned her attention to preparing for the meeting. She changed from her day dress into a more formal evening gown of deep green silk, another of her mother's dresses, altered to fit her simpler lifestyle. It was perhaps overly fine for a governess, but she wanted to present a dignified appearance for this unusual conference. At 5 minutes to 10, Beatrice made her way quietly through the silent corridors of Kenswick Manor. The grandeur that had impressed her on her arrival now seemed oppressive in the dim light of the wall sconces, the shadows turning familiar corners into mysterious caverns. The library door was closed when she reached it. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Beatrice knocked softly. "Enter," came the Duke's voice from within. The library was a vast room, 2 stories high, with bookshelves lining every wall and a gallery running around the upper level. A fire burned in the massive fireplace, casting a warm glow over the leather armchairs arranged before it. The Duke stood by the fire, a crystal glass in his hand, his formal evening attire suggesting he had recently returned from dining with his guests. "Miss Zephyr," he said, turning as she entered, "thank you for coming at such an unconventional hour." "Your Grace," Beatrice replied, curtsying, "how may I be of service regarding Lady Sophia?" The Duke gestured to one of the armchairs. "Please be seated. Would you care for a glass of sherry?" "No, thank you, Your Grace," Beatrice declined, perching on the edge of the chair he had indicated. Despite his assurances of propriety, she felt keenly aware of the impropriety of their situation, alone together, late at night, with the household asleep. The Duke took the chair opposite, studying her face in the firelight. "I must confess, Miss Zephyr, that my request to speak with you was not entirely about Sophia, though she is certainly part of my concern." Beatrice tensed. "I don't understand, Your Grace." "I have reason to believe you overheard a conversation between my cousin and myself this afternoon," he said directly. "A conversation regarding your position in this household." Heat rushed to Beatrice's face. I did not intend to eavesdrop, Your Grace. I was returning from a walk and happened to pass the library when—" He raised a hand to stop her. "I am not accusing you, Miss Zephyr. I merely wish to address any concerns you might have as a result of what you heard." Beatrice hesitated, uncertain how to respond. The Duke saved her the trouble by continuing. "My cousin's views are her own and do not reflect my opinion or intentions. I want to assure you that your position here is secure for as long as you wish to remain." "That is most kind, Your Grace," Beatrice said carefully. "However, I cannot help but be concerned by Lady Harrington's suggestion that my presence might cause gossip that could harm your reputation or Lady Sophia's future prospects." The Duke's expression hardened. "Agatha has a talent for manipulating situations to her advantage. In this case, she wishes to place her own candidate in the position of Sophia's governess, likely someone who would be more amenable to her influence." "Even so," Beatrice persisted, "if there is truth to her claim about society's reaction to my presence—" "Society," the Duke interrupted, "is a collection of idle minds more concerned with appearance than substance. I have never governed my actions by its arbitrary standards, and I do not intend to start now." "That is admirable, Your Grace," Beatrice said softly, "but perhaps impractical. Lady Sophia will one day need to move in those circles. Her acceptance, her opportunities for a suitable match, could be affected by association with someone like me." "Someone like you," the Duke repeated, his blue eyes intent on her face. "You mean someone intelligent, compassionate, and dedicated to her welfare. I should think such association could only benefit Sophia." "You know that is not what I mean, Your Grace," Beatrice said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. "I mean someone visibly marked, someone whose appearance causes discomfort or pity, someone who reminds others of the fragility of beauty and life." "Beauty," the Duke said, rising abruptly and moving to the fireplace, "is a poor standard by which to measure a person's worth." "Perhaps," Beatrice conceded, "but it is the standard by which society operates, particularly for women. We both know this to be true." The Duke turned to face her, the firelight casting his strong features into sharp relief. "And yet, Miss Zephyr, I find myself increasingly impatient with such shallow measures. Since you came to Kenswick Manor, I have observed you closely. I have seen your patience with a traumatized child, your intellectual rigor in your teaching methods, your kindness to the staff, your dignity in the face of my cousin's thinly veiled hostility." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "These qualities have impressed me far more deeply than any fleeting beauty ever could." Beatrice's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he must hear it. "Your Grace, No," he said, raising a hand to halt her words. "I have spoken improperly. Forgive me. I asked you here to reassure you of your position, not to make you uncomfortable with inappropriate observations." "They were not inappropriate," Beatrice said, surprising herself with her boldness. They were kind, and I am grateful for them. Few people look beyond my scars to see the person beneath. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a softening, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his usual commanding presence. I see you, Beatrice, he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. I have from the moment you entered my study in London. The intimacy of the moment stretched between them, fragile and dangerous. Beatrice knew she should leave, should thank him for his reassurance and retreat to the safety of her rooms. But she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to break the connection that had formed between them. The library door opening shattered the moment. Richardson stood in the doorway, his usual impassive expression replaced by one of urgency. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion," he said, his gaze flickering briefly to Beatrice before returning to the Duke. "Lady Sophia is asking for Miss Zephyr. Mrs. Wilson says the child woke from a nightmare and is most distressed." "Of course," Beatrice said immediately, rising from her chair. "I'll go to her at once." "I'll accompany you," the Duke said, setting down his glass. "If she is truly distressed, my presence may help calm her." They made their way swiftly to the nursery floor, the tension of their interrupted conversation giving way to shared concern for Sophia. Mrs. Wilson met them in the corridor outside the child's room, her expression harried. "Oh, Miss Zephyr, thank goodness," the nurse said. "She woke up screaming, poor lamb, though no sound came out. She's been writing your name over and over on her slate." "I'm here now," Beatrice said soothingly. "Has she had nightmares before?" "Not for several weeks," Mrs. Wilson replied, glancing at the Duke. "Not since you came, actually, Miss Zephyr." Beatrice turned to the Duke. "With your permission, Your Grace, I'll go to her alone first. Too many people might overwhelm her." He nodded, though concern was evident in his face. "Of course. I'll wait here in case you need me." Beatrice entered Sophia's darkened bedchamber, lit only by a single candle beside the bed. The child was huddled against the headboard, her small face tear-streaked, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders. When she saw Beatrice, she launched herself across the bed, flinging her arms around her governess's waist with a desperation that broke Beatrice's heart. "SHH, I'm here now," Beatrice murmured, stroking the child's hair. "You're safe, dear one. It was just a dream." Sophia pulled back, reaching frantically for her slate. She scribbled quickly, then thrust it toward Beatrice. "Fire, Mama and Papa trapped, couldn't save them." "Oh, Sophia," Beatrice whispered, gathering the child close again. "It was a dream, but it feels very real, doesn't it? The helplessness, the fear, the terrible sadness." Sophia nodded against her shoulder, her small body trembling. Beatrice gently guided her back to the pillows, sitting beside her on the bed. "Would it help if I told you about my dream, the one I have sometimes, about the fire that gave me these scars?" Sophia's eyes widened, and she nodded again. "In my dream, I am trying to reach my father," Beatrice said softly. "He is calling for me, but the flames are too high, the smoke too thick. I try to crawl to him, but something always holds me back. And I wake up feeling that I have failed him, that I should have tried harder, moved faster, been braver." Sophia scribbled on her slate. "Yes, that is how I feel. But here is what I have learned, Sophia," Beatrice continued, brushing a lock of hair from the child's forehead. "These dreams come from our love for those we lost, and from our grief that we could not save them. They do not mean we failed. They mean we loved deeply, and that love continues even though our dear ones are gone." Sophia stared at her intently, her small face serious in the candlelight. After a moment she wrote, "Does the dream ever go away? It comes less often as time passes," Beatrice said honestly, "and it loses some of its power to hurt us, but the love that never goes away. And that is a comfort, even in our sadness." Sophia considered this, then wrote something that made Beatrice's breath catch. "Do you think Uncle Kenneth has dreams too?" "I think everyone who has lost someone they love has such dreams in their own way," Beatrice replied carefully. "Your uncle loved your mother very much. She was his sister, his family. His grief is different from yours, but it is grief nonetheless." Sophia nodded, seeming to find this answer satisfactory. She wrote again. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course I will," Beatrice promised, settling more comfortably on the bed. "Would you like me to read to you or simply sit with you?" Just stay, Sophia wrote, her eyelids already beginning to droop with exhaustion. Then I'll stay, Beatrice said, taking the child's small hand in hers. Sleep now, dear one. You're safe and you're loved. Within minutes, Sophia had drifted back to sleep, her breathing deep and regular, her face peaceful. Beatrice sat watching her for some time, marveling at the resilience of this child who had endured such loss yet still reached for connection, for understanding. Eventually, she rose carefully from the bed, tucking the covers around Sophia's sleeping form. As she turned toward the door, she was startled to find the Duke standing in the shadows, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Your Grace," she whispered, moving toward him, "I didn't realize you were here." "I came in when I heard you talking about the fire," he said, his voice equally low. "I hope you don't mind." "No, of course not," Beatrice replied, glancing back at Sophia. "She's sleeping now. The nightmare seems to have passed." "Thanks to you," the Duke said. He gestured toward the door. "Shall we leave her to rest?" In the corridor outside, Mrs. Wilson waited anxiously. "Is she settled, Miss Zephyr?" "Yes, she's sleeping peacefully now," Beatrice assured her. "But perhaps you could check on her once more before you retire." "Of course, miss," the nurse said, clearly relieved. "Thank you for coming so promptly." When Mrs. Wilson had gone into Sophia's room, the Duke turned to Beatrice. "Walk with me a moment," he said, not quite a request but not quite a command either. They moved silently down the corridor to a small sitting room that connected the nursery to the schoolroom. The Duke closed the door behind them, then turned to Beatrice, his expression grave. "You never told me the full story of your scars," he said. "That night, you said only that there was a fire, that you tried to save your family and failed." "Yes," Beatrice said, her throat tightening. "That is the essence of it." "But there is more," he pressed. "What you told Sophia, about being held back, about feeling you should have done more." "It is what I feel," Beatrice admitted. "Whether it is the whole truth is another matter." The Duke studied her face in the dim light of the single lamp burning in the room. "Will you tell me, not as your employer, but as someone who cares?" The simple words, spoken with such evident sincerity, broke something inside Beatrice, a dam she had built around her memories of that terrible night. "It was just my father and I," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother died when I was born, and he never remarried. He was a scholar, often lost in his books and research. We lived in a small house near Oxford where he taught." She moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond, finding it easier to speak without meeting the Duke's intent gaze. "The fire began in his study, late at night. A candle, we think, or perhaps his pipe. I woke to the smell of smoke and ran to his room, but the hallway was already engulfed in flames. I tried to reach him. I could hear him calling for me, but a beam fell, blocking the way." She paused, the memory so vivid she could almost feel the heat on her skin again. "A neighbor, alerted by the smoke, pulled me from the house. I fought him, tried to break free to go back for my father, but he held me back, said it was too late, that I would only die as well." She touched her scarred cheek, unconsciously. "I had already been burned trying to reach the study. Later, they told me I was fortunate, that many with such injuries do not survive, or are left far more severely disfigured." "Fortunate," the Duke echoed, an edge of bitterness in his voice. "A cold comfort when you had lost everything else." "Yes," Beatrice agreed softly. "But in time, I came to see that they were right in their way. I survived, and in surviving I had choices, however limited they might seem." "To become a governess," the Duke said. "To continue living," Beatrice corrected him. "To find purpose again, teaching became that purpose, children. They see beyond appearances once they become accustomed to them. They judge by actions, by kindness, by attention. It is adults who cannot move past the visible to see what lies beneath." "Not all adults," the Duke said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Some of us are capable of seeing clearly." Beatrice turned to face him, finding his gaze already fixed on her face, not avoiding her scars, but not dwelling on them either, simply seeing her, all of her. "Your niece is fortunate to have you, Your Grace," she said. "Your willingness to look beyond conventional wisdom, to see her needs clearly, speaks well of your character." "Kenneth," he said unexpectedly. When we are alone, I wish you would call me Kenneth. The intimacy of the request startled her. I couldn't, it wouldn't be proper. Propriety, he said, a hint of frustration in his voice. Always propriety. Tell me, Beatrice, has adherence to propriety ever brought you happiness? It has brought me safety, she countered. A woman in my position cannot afford to ignore the rules of society, however arbitrary they may seem. And if those rules prevent genuine connection, authentic understanding between two people, then that is the price we pay for our respective places in the world, Beatrice said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. You are a duke, and I am your niece's governess. Society has very clear expectations for how such relationships should be conducted. And yet I find myself increasingly unwilling to be constrained by those expectations, Kenneth said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Not when they stand between me and what I truly want. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice knew she should step back, re-establish the proper distance between employer and employee, but she found herself unable to move. What is it that you truly want, Your Grace? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment, it seemed he might answer with actions rather than words. His gaze dropped to her lips, and he leaned infinitesimally closer. Beatrice's heart pounded against her ribs, a mixture of terror and longing paralyzing her. Then, with visible effort, Kenneth stepped back. Forgiveness, he said, his voice rough. I have spoken inappropriately. Again, you are under my protection in my employment. I have no right to confuse matters with personal feelings. No, Beatrice agreed, relief and disappointment warring within her. You do not. I should escort you back to your quarters, he said formally. Once again the Duke of Kenswick rather than the vulnerable man of moments before. It grows late, and you have had a trying evening. Thank you, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, equally formal, accepting the retreat to safer ground even as part of her mourned what might have been. They walked in silence through the darkened corridors, the distance between them far greater than the few feet of polished flooring that separated them physically. At the door to her rooms, Kenneth paused. Thank you for your care of Sophia tonight, he said. Your understanding of her fears, your willingness to share your own experiences. It means more than I can express. It is my duty, Your Grace, Beatrice said, though they both knew it had gone far beyond duty. Good night, Miss Zephyr, he said, inclining his head in a formal bow. Good night, Your Grace, she replied, curtsying before slipping into her room and closing the door firmly behind her. Alone in the darkness, Beatrice pressed her fingers to her lips, imagining for one forbidden moment what might have happened if the Duke, if Kenneth, had given in to whatever impulse had briefly overcome him. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Foolish, foolish woman, she whispered to herself, moving to her dressing table to begin unpinning her hair. He is a duke, and you are a scarred governess. Whatever he may think he feels is mere momentary fascination, or worse, pity. Yet as she prepared for bed, Beatrice could not entirely dismiss the look in his eyes when he'd asked her to use his given name. It had not been pity she'd seen there, nor mere fascination. It had been something far more dangerous, recognition, the kind of recognition that occurs when one soul sees itself reflected in another. And that, Beatrice knew, was the most perilous thing of all. The days following Sophia's nightmare brought subtle but significant changes to the household at Kenswick Manor. Lady Harrington and her daughters, initially expected to stay a fortnight, announced their departure after just 10 days, citing a pressing invitation from the Countess of Stratham that could not be declined. The Duke accepted their excuses with what Beatrice suspected was poorly concealed relief, though he maintained all proper courtesies as they departed. More surprising was Sophia's behavior following the nightmare. The child began accompanying Beatrice everywhere, as if afraid to let her governess out of her sight. She also started carrying a small notebook and pencil at all times, communicating more freely not just with Beatrice, but with her uncle and even the servants. Most remarkable of all was her reaction to her cousin's departure. As the Harrington carriage pulled away down the drive, Sophia tugged at her uncle's sleeve and presented him with a note. I'm glad they're gone. Can we have tea with just you and Miss Zephyr now? The Duke's startled laugh had been genuine, his blue eyes warming as he glanced at Beatrice. "Yes, Sophia, I believe we can arrange that." Thus began a new routine. Tea in the library rather than the nursery, with just the three of them. The Duke would read from The Secret Garden, which they had nearly finished, while Sophia and Beatrice worked on their pressed flower collection or sketched the changing autumn landscape visible through the library's tall windows. These afternoons became the highlight of Beatrice's days. The Duke, for she still could not bring herself to think of him as Kenneth, despite his request, proved to be a thoughtful, engaging companion. He spoke to Sophia not as a child to be indulged, but as a person worthy of respect, explaining concepts she didn't understand and asking her opinion on matters within her comprehension. With Beatrice, too, he was different, less formal, more willing to share his own thoughts and interests. She discovered his passion for architecture, his knowledge of classical literature, his dry wit that emerged when he was truly comfortable. In turn, she found herself sharing more of her own interests, her love of poetry, her fascination with the natural sciences, her memories of traveling through Italy with her father when she was barely older than Sophia. If there were moments when their eyes met for a beat too long, if their fingers occasionally brushed when passing a book or a teacup, neither acknowledged it. The night of their conversation in the nursery sitting room seemed to exist in some parallel reality, not to be referenced or revisited. Yet Beatrice was acutely aware that something had shifted between them. There was an ease, a familiarity that went beyond the conventional relationship between employer and employee. The Duke sought her opinion not just on Sophia's education, but on books he was reading, political matters discussed in the newspapers, even the renovations he was considering for the east wing of the manor. She told herself it was merely that he was isolated at Kenswick, with few intellectual equals nearby, that she was convenient, available, and educated enough to provide the conversation he craved, that his kindness was simply an extension of his gratitude for Sophia's progress. But in the privacy of her own thoughts, late at night, Beatrice allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. The Duke of Kenswick saw her as no one had since before the fire, not as a tragic figure, not as a damaged spinster, but as a woman of intelligence, courage, and worth. And she was falling in love with him. It was madness, of course. Even if he harbored some genuine affection for her, which she doubted, despite occasional evidence to the contrary, there could be no future in it. A duke did not marry a scarred governess, no matter how enlightened his personal views might be. His duty to his title, to his family legacy, would always take precedence over personal inclination. So Beatrice guarded her heart as best she could, treasuring the afternoons in the library while preparing herself for their inevitable end. Sooner or later, the Duke would need to return to London for the season. Sophia would eventually speak again and re-enter society, and Beatrice would either remain at Kenswick as a governess, watching from the margins, or seek employment elsewhere when her services were no longer required. Autumn deepened around Kenswick Manor. The brilliant reds and golds of September gave way to the more sombre browns and russets of late October. Morning frost silvered the lawns, and fires burned in every room by mid-afternoon. Beatrice added wool shawls to her daily attire, and Sophia began wearing the fur-lined cloak the Duke had commissioned for her birthday, a garment the child had initially rejected but now cherished. One crisp morning in early November, as Beatrice and Sophia were completing their French lesson, Richardson appeared at the schoolroom door. "Miss Zephyr," he said, his usual formal manner softened by what appeared to be genuine regret, "His Grace requests your presence in the library at your earliest convenience. Lady Sophia is to continue her studies with Mrs. Wilson until your return." Beatrice's heart sank. Such a formal summons, delivered by Richardson rather than conveyed personally during their afternoon tea, suggested something significant and likely unpleasant. "Of course, Richardson," she replied, keeping her voice steady for Sophia's benefit. "I'll come at once." Sophia looked up from her French exercise, her expression questioning. She reached for her notebook and wrote quickly, "Is something wrong?" "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," Beatrice assured her, though she felt far from certain herself. "Perhaps your uncle wishes to discuss the arrangements for Christmas. It's only 6 weeks away after all." Sophia seemed unconvinced, but returned to her exercise without further protest. Beatrice squeezed her shoulder gently before following Richardson from the room. As they descended the grand staircase, Beatrice smoothed her grey dress nervously, wishing she had taken more care with her appearance that morning. Her hair was neatly arranged, but a few tendrils had escaped during an impromptu game of hide-and-seek with Sophia before breakfast, a rare moment of childish exuberance that Beatrice had been loath to curtail. "Do you know what His Grace wishes to discuss, Richardson?" she asked the butler as they reached the ground floor. "I am not privy to His Grace's thoughts, Miss Zephyr," Richardson replied, though something in his tone suggested he knew more than he was saying. "However, I believe you will find him in a contemplative mood this morning." Before Beatrice could press for clarification, they reached the library door. Richardson knocked once, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Miss Zephyr, Your Grace," he announced, then withdrew, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence of the vast room. The Duke stood by one of the tall windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the frost-covered gardens. He was dressed more formally than usual for a morning at home, in a well-cut coat of dark blue superfine and immaculate buff trousers. "Miss Zephyr," he said, turning as she curtsied. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, noting the unusual formality in his manner. "How may I assist you?" The Duke gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please be seated. What I have to discuss requires some explanation." Beatrice sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their slight trembling. The Duke remained standing, moving to the fireplace rather than taking the chair opposite her. "I have received a letter from London," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "from my solicitor regarding certain business matters that require my attention." "I see," Beatrice said, though she did not see at all what this had to do with her. "I must return to London next week," the Duke continued. "I had hoped to remain at Kenswick through the winter, but circumstances make that impossible." Now it became clear. He was informing her that the household would relocate to London, which meant decisions about her position. Would she accompany them, or remain at Kenswick with a reduced staff? Or perhaps he intended to release her entirely, now that Sophia was showing such improvement. "I understand, Your Grace," Beatrice said, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden hollowness in her chest. "Will Lady Sophia accompany you to London?" "That is what I wish to discuss with you," the Duke said, finally turning to face her directly. "Sophia has made remarkable progress under your care these past months. She is communicating, engaging with her studies, even showing interest in the world beyond Kenswick again. But she has still not spoken, and I fear the stimulation and scrutiny of London society might undo all the good work you have accomplished." Beatrice nodded, relief tempering her earlier apprehension. "I agree, Your Grace. Lady Sophia is still quite fragile, despite her progress. The pressure to speak in social settings, the inevitable questions about her parents' accident, it could be overwhelming for her." "My thoughts precisely," the Duke said, some of the tension leaving his shoulders at her agreement. "Therefore, I propose that Sophia remain at Kenswick for the time being, with you continuing as her governess. I shall return as often as my business permits, and we will reassess the situation in the spring." "A sensible plan, Your Grace," Beatrice said, though the thought of the manor without his presence left her with an unexpected sense of loss. "I am happy to continue Lady Sophia's education here, where she feels secure. There is one complication," the Duke added, moving to take the seat opposite her at last. "My absence may extend through Christmas. It would be Sophia's first Christmas without her parents." The unspoken concern was clear. Would the child suffer a setback if her uncle, her only remaining family, was absent during the holiday? "It will be difficult for her," Beatrice acknowledged. "But children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure in their surroundings. We can make Christmas at Kenswick special in its own way, honoring her parents' memory while creating new traditions that bring her joy." "I had hoped you would say something of the sort," the Duke said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "You have a gift for seeing the path forward, even in challenging circumstances." "I merely try to consider what is best for Lady Sophia," Beatrice demurred, though she was touched by his praise. And what of you, Miss Zephyr? The Duke asked unexpectedly, his blue eyes intent on her face. Does the prospect of a winter at Kenswick, largely without company save for a silent child and a household of servants, not dismay you? The question caught Beatrice off guard. I have never required much society, Your Grace. Books, music, the changing seasons, these have always been companionship enough for me. And Lady Sophia, though silent, is hardly lacking in personality or intelligence. No, indeed, the Duke agreed with a genuine smile. My niece has opinions enough for 3 children her age, even without giving them voice. Precisely, Beatrice said, returning his smile. We shall manage quite well until your return. The Duke studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her expression. Whatever he sought, he seemed satisfied, for he nodded once before rising from his chair. Then it is settled, he said. I shall depart for London next Tuesday. Richardson and Mrs. Grave will remain to oversee the household, along with a reduced staff. You will have full authority regarding Sophia's daily routine and activities. Thank you for your trust, Your Grace, Beatrice said, rising as well. I shall do my utmost to ensure Lady Sophia continues to thrive in your absence. Of that I have no doubt, the Duke said. He hesitated, then added, there is one more matter I wish to discuss with you of a more personal nature. Beatrice tensed, uncertain what to expect. Yes, Your Grace. I have observed that your wardrobe, while perfectly adequate, is perhaps not entirely suitable for the colder months at Kenswick, he said carefully. The manor can be quite draughty in winter, particularly in the East Wing, where your rooms are located. Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. It was true that her few dresses, made of lightweight wool and cotton, were better suited to a London townhouse than a draughty country manor in winter. But to have her employer comment on the inadequacy of her clothing was mortifying. I assure you I shall manage, Your Grace, she said stiffly. I have a warm shawl and— Forgive me, the Duke interrupted, looking genuinely distressed by her reaction. I have expressed myself poorly. I meant no criticism. Rather, I wish to offer. That is, I have taken the liberty of asking Mrs. Grave to arrange for some warmer garments to be made for you. Practical items, a heavy cloak, woolen dresses, proper boots for walking in the snow. Consider it part of your compensation for remaining at Kenswick through the winter. Beatrice was torn between gratitude for his thoughtfulness and discomfort at accepting what felt uncomfortably like charity. That is most generous, Your Grace, but I couldn't possibly. It is not generosity, but necessity, the Duke insisted. I would be a poor employer indeed if I allowed you to fall ill from cold while caring for my niece. Please accept this practical provision without further protest. Put in those terms, Beatrice could hardly refuse. Thank you, Your Grace, she said finally. That is indeed most practical. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes at her grudging acceptance. Excellent. Mrs. Grave will consult with you regarding your preferences. I believe the local seamstress has already been engaged to begin work immediately. Before Beatrice could respond to this evidence of his forethought, the library door opened, and Sophia burst in, followed by a harried-looking Mrs. Wilson. I'm sorry, Your Grace, the nurse said breathlessly. She insisted on coming to find Miss Zephyr when the French lesson ended. Sophia rushed to Beatrice's side, clutching her notebook. She had written in large, urgent letters. Are you leaving? Did Uncle Kenneth dismiss you? No, dear one, Beatrice assured her, kneeling to meet the child's anxious gaze. I'm not leaving. Your uncle and I were discussing arrangements for the winter, that's all. Sophia's shoulders slumped in relief. She turned to her uncle, writing quickly, I heard Richardson say you were sending for Miss Zephyr. I thought it was bad news. Eavesdropping is unbecoming in a young lady, the Duke said, though his tone held more affection than censure. But I understand your concern. No, I was not dismissing Miss Zephyr. Quite the contrary. I was ensuring she would remain at Kenswick to care for you while I am away in London. Sophia's expression shifted from relief to alarm. She wrote, You're leaving? For how long? Several weeks, I'm afraid, the Duke replied gently. Perhaps through Christmas. But I shall return as soon as my business is concluded, and Miss Zephyr will be here with you the entire time. The child considered this, her small face serious. After a moment she wrote, "Will you be back for my birthday, February 12? I give you my word," the Duke said solemnly. "Wild horses could not keep me from Kenswick for your 8th birthday." This seemed to satisfy Sophia, for she nodded once before writing. "Can we have tea in the library today, all 3 of us?" "Of course," the Duke agreed, his expression softening as he regarded his niece. 4 o'clock as usual, and perhaps Miss Zephyr would be kind enough to play the pianoforte for us afterward. I noticed the instrument has been silent since Lady Harrington's departure. Surprised by the request, Beatrice hesitated. "I play only moderately well, Your Grace." Lady Harrington's performance was far superior to anything I could offer. "But you play with feeling," the Duke countered. "Agatha's technical proficiency cannot compensate for her lack of emotional expression." It was perhaps the most direct criticism Beatrice had ever heard him make of his cousin, and she couldn't help but smile at the accuracy of his assessment. Lady Harrington had played brilliantly but mechanically, her performances clearly intended to showcase her skill rather than convey the music's emotional essence. "In that case, I should be happy to play this afternoon," Beatrice said. "Though I warn you, my repertoire is limited to pieces I can recall from memory. It has been some years since I had regular access to a pianoforte." "Play whatever brings you joy," the Duke said simply. "That is all the artistry required." With that, he excused himself, citing correspondence that required his attention before luncheon. As Beatrice led Sophia back to the schoolroom to resume their lessons, she found herself contemplating the complexities of the Duke's character. Formal yet compassionate, authoritative yet considerate, reserved yet capable of surprising warmth, he defied easy categorization. And soon he would be gone from Kenswick, leaving her with memories and unanswered questions about the nature of their relationship. Was she merely a valued employee to him, a convenient solution to the problem of his niece's care? Or was there something more, something neither of them dared to name or acknowledge? The afternoon's tea and music might offer no answers, but Beatrice resolved to treasure it nonetheless. Such moments of genuine connection were rare in her experience, and all the more precious for their impermanence. The day of the Duke's departure dawned cold and grey, with a thick fog that shrouded Kenswick Manor in ghostly silence. Beatrice woke early, a sense of unease settling in her stomach as she dressed in one of her new woolen gowns, a rich burgundy that was far more flattering than her old grey dresses. The seamstress had worked miracles in the week since the Duke's announcement, producing 3 winter dresses, a heavy cloak lined with fur, sturdy boots, and warm gloves that concealed Beatrice's scarred hands without restricting their movement. The clothing was of a quality Beatrice had not possessed since before the fire, yet somehow the Duke had managed to ensure they were practical rather than ostentatious, suitable for a governess, if an unusually well-appointed one. As she pinned her hair into its usual simple style, Beatrice tried to quell the melancholy that had been growing in her since the Duke announced his departure. It was foolish to feel bereft when he would return in a few months. Foolish, too, to have become so accustomed to his presence in such a short time. Yet the afternoons in the library, the shared concern for Sophia, the growing ease of their conversations, all had created a bond that Beatrice had not anticipated when she arrived at Kenswick. The Duke had become not just her employer, but something like a friend, though even that word seemed inadequate for the complex relationship that had developed between them. A soft knock at her door interrupted these reflections. "Come in," she called, expecting Jenny with her morning tea. Instead, Sophia slipped into the room, still in her nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her small face was solemn, her blue eyes, so like her uncle's, troubled. "Sophia," Beatrice said, surprised, "you're up early. Is something wrong?" The child climbed onto Beatrice's bed, pulling her ever-present notebook from the pocket of her nightgown. She wrote quickly, "Uncle Kenneth is leaving today." "Yes, dear one," Beatrice said gently, sitting beside her. "But he will return, as he promised, and we shall have many interesting activities to fill our days until then." Sophia shook her head, writing again, "He might not come back." Like Mama and Papa. Ah, so that was the source of her distress. The child feared losing another loved one, another constant in her life. "Your uncle is only going to London," Beatrice explained, putting an arm around Sophia's thin shoulders. "He will write to us and we to him. He will return for your birthday as he promised. This separation is temporary, not permanent. Sophia considered this, then wrote, but what if something happens? Accidents happen. The echo of Beatrice's own fears in the child's words was unsettling. She, too, had been trying to ignore the small voice of anxiety, suggesting that the Duke might not return, that some misfortune might befall him in London, leaving Sophia orphaned again and Beatrice. What, bereft in a different way? It is natural to worry about those we care for, Beatrice said carefully, but we cannot allow fear to overshadow our days. Your uncle is a careful man, not given to recklessness. He has every reason to return safely to Kenswick, to you. Sophia seemed only partially convinced. She wrote, can we do something special before he goes, to remind him to come back? Beatrice smiled at the child's logic, as if the Duke might forget his home and his niece without a proper reminder. What did you have in mind? After a moment's thought, Sophia wrote, a special breakfast. And I want to give him something to take with him. Those are lovely ideas, Beatrice agreed. Why don't you get dressed, and we'll speak to Mrs. Grave about arranging a special breakfast. As for a gift, perhaps you could draw something for your uncle to keep with him in London. Sophia nodded eagerly, sliding off the bed and heading for the door that connected their rooms. She paused at the threshold, turning back to write one more note. Thank you for staying with me, Miss Beatrice. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else, Beatrice replied honestly, touched by the child's simple gratitude. Once Sophia had gone to dress, Beatrice finished her own preparations for the day. She selected a cameo brooch, one of the few pieces of jewelry she had salvaged from the fire, to adorn the high collar of her new dress. The small touch of elegance seemed appropriate for the Duke's departure, a gesture of respect for the occasion, even if he might not notice it. Mrs. Grave was surprisingly receptive to the idea of a special breakfast, perhaps because it aligned with her own desire to send the Duke off properly. By 8 o'clock, the small family dining room was prepared with all the Duke's favourite morning dishes: kedgeree, devilled kidneys, freshly baked bread, and preserves from the Kenswick orchards. Beatrice and Sophia were already seated when the Duke entered, his expression registering surprise at the elaborate spread and at their presence. Normally, he breakfasted alone in his study on days when business required his attention. Good morning, he said, taking his place at the head of the table. This is an unexpected pleasure. Lady Sophia wished to share breakfast with you before your departure, Beatrice explained. Mrs. Grave was kind enough to accommodate our request. A thoughtful gesture, the Duke said, his gaze softening as it rested on his niece. Thank you, Sophia. The child beamed, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. She placed it beside the Duke's plate, watching expectantly as he unwrapped it. Inside was a miniature watercolor painting of Kenswick Manor, remarkably detailed for a child of 7, with the autumn woods rendered in golds and russets behind the imposing structure. At the bottom, Sophia had written in her careful hand, "Please come home soon." The Duke stared at the painting for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. When he finally looked up, there was a suspicious brightness in his blue eyes. "This is a treasure, Sophia," he said, his voice slightly rough. "I shall keep it with me always in London as a reminder of what awaits me at Kenswick." Sophia smiled, more animated than Beatrice had seen her since the Duke announced his departure. She wrote in her notebook, "Miss Beatrice helped with the perspective, but the colours are all mine." "You have your mother's talent," the Duke said, carefully placing the painting in his breast pocket. "Catherine could capture the essence of a place in just a few brushstrokes. She would be very proud of you, as am I." Breakfast proceeded more cheerfully after that, with the Duke inquiring about their plans for the coming weeks. Beatrice outlined the educational program she had developed, which included not only traditional subjects, but also special projects designed to engage Sophia's creativity. Creating a herbarium of winter plants, learning to bake with the cook, redesigning a small portion of the garden for spring planting. "It sounds as if I shall hardly be missed," the Duke commented, though his tone suggested he was pleased rather than offended by their plans. Sophia shook her head vigorously, writing, "We will miss you very much. But Miss Beatrice says we must keep busy to make the time pass quickly until you return." "Miss Zephyr is very wise," the Duke said, his gaze meeting Beatrice's across the table with a warmth that made her cheeks heat slightly. "And I too shall keep busy in London, so that I may return to Kenswick as soon as possible." All too soon, breakfast was over, and the Duke rose to make his final preparations for departure. The carriage had been brought around to the front entrance, his luggage already loaded, his valet waiting with his greatcoat and hat. In the grand entrance hall, the staff had assembled to bid their master farewell, a tradition at Kenswick Richardson had explained to Beatrice. The Duke spoke briefly with each senior servant, giving instructions or inquiring about family matters with an attention to detail that revealed his genuine concern for their welfare. Finally, he turned to Beatrice and Sophia, who stood slightly apart from the staff, their positions in the household somewhere between family and servants, not quite one, not entirely the other. "Lady Sophia," the Duke said formally, kneeling to his niece's level, "I entrust you to Miss Zephyr's care, knowing she will guide you wisely in my absence. I expect you to continue your studies diligently and to conduct yourself as the lady you are becoming." Sophia nodded solemnly, then impulsively threw her arms around her uncle's neck in a fierce embrace. It was the most demonstrative Beatrice had ever seen the child, and for a moment the Duke seemed startled by the display of affection. Then his arms came around his niece, holding her close to his chest. He held her for a long moment, resting his chin on the top of her dark head, his eyes meeting Beatrice's over the child's shoulder. "Be brave, Sophia," he whispered. "I shall return before you know it." He released her gently, standing to his full height. He turned to Beatrice, extending his hand. "Miss Zephyr," he said. Beatrice placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin through her glove. "Safe journey, Your Grace." "Take care of them," he murmured, his thumb pressing briefly against her knuckles in a gesture that was hidden from the assembled staff but felt scorching to Beatrice. "I will," she promised. He released her hand, nodded once to Richardson, and strode out the door to the waiting carriage. A footman held the door, then closed it with a solid thud. The driver cracked his whip, and the horses surged forward, gravel crunching beneath the wheels, as the Duke of Kenswick departed. Sophia watched until the carriage disappeared into the fog, her small hand gripping Beatrice's tightly. "Come," Beatrice said softly, turning the child away from the door. "Let us go and check on our herbarium. I believe the lavender we pressed last week should be ready for mounting." The weeks that followed passed in a quiet rhythm of study and domesticity. Beatrice kept her promise to keep Sophia busy, filling their days with lessons, projects, and long walks in the brisk winter air. True to his word, the Duke wrote regularly, letters addressed to Sophia but filled with observations and inquiries that Beatrice knew were meant for her as well. Sophia wrote back faithfully, her letters becoming longer and more expressive with each post. Beatrice added her own reports, keeping her tone professional but allowing occasional glimpses of the personal warmth she felt. December arrived with snow and biting winds. The manor was decorated with holly and ivy, and the staff began preparations for the Christmas feast. Beatrice and Sophia spent hours making paper ornaments and pomanders, filling the nursery with the scent of cloves and oranges. Yet as Christmas drew nearer, the Duke's absence was felt more keenly. His letters spoke of difficult negotiations and delays, though he continued to promise he would return for Sophia's birthday in February. On Christmas Eve, a heavy snowstorm descended on Kenswick, isolating the manor from the village. Beatrice and Sophia sat by the nursery fire, reading the Christmas story from the Gospel of Luke. "And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes," Beatrice read, her voice soft in the quiet room. A commotion in the hall below made her pause. Voices, the banging of the front door, the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. Sophia scrambled off the window seat, rushing to the door just as it burst open. The Duke stood there, covered in snow, his face red from the cold but beaming with triumph. "Uncle Kenneth," Sophia cried, not a written note but a joyous verbal shout that rang through the room. She froze, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized what she had done. The Duke dropped his bags and fell to his knees, opening his arms. "Sophia." She ran to him, sobbing, and buried her face in his coat. "You came back," she wept, the words tumbling out in a rush of released emotion. "You came back." "I told you I would," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held her. "I promised." Beatrice stood by the fire, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped over her heart. He had returned. And he had brought Sophia's voice with him. The Duke looked up, his eyes finding Beatrice across the room. The look he gave her, full of gratitude, relief, and something far deeper, made her knees weak. "Happy Christmas, Beatrice," he said softly. "Happy Christmas, Kenneth," she whispered, abandoning propriety for the truth of her heart. The next few weeks were a revelation. Sophia, having found her voice, seemed determined to make up for lost time, chattering happily from morning until night. The Duke remained at Kenswick, ignoring the summons of his solicitors to return to London. "Business can wait," he told Beatrice as they walked in the winter garden one afternoon while Sophia built a snowman nearby. "Some things are more important." "Sophia is thriving," Beatrice agreed, watching the child. "I wasn't speaking only of Sophia," the Duke said. He stopped, turning to face her. "I spoke to my solicitors about more than business in London, Beatrice. I spoke to them about precedents. Precedents. Regarding marriage," he said directly. "Specifically, the marriage of a peer to a woman of no fortune but impeccable character." Beatrice went still. "Your Grace." "Kenneth," he corrected gently. "Please," he took her hands, his thumbs brushing over the scars on her wrists where her gloves ended. "I went to London to settle my affairs, yes, but also to ensure that if I made a choice that society disapproved of, my position, and Sophia's, would be secure." "And is it?" she asked, her breath hitching. "It is. My title is old enough and my fortune large enough that society may whisper, but they will not dare to cut us. And if they do," he shrugged, "then we shall live at Kenswick and let them rot in their drawing rooms." He raised her hands to his lips, kissing the scars. "I love you, Beatrice. I love your courage, your mind, your heart. I love the way you have healed my niece, and the way you have healed me." He looked into her eyes, his gaze steady and sure. "Will you marry me? Will you be my Duchess, and Sophia's aunt in truth?" Beatrice looked at the man who offered her not just a title, but a home, a man who saw her scars not as defects, but as proof of her strength. "They will say you are mad," she whispered. "To marry a scarred governess." "Let them say what they will," Kenneth replied, smiling. "I know that I am the sanest man in England, for I have found the only woman worth loving." "Yes," Beatrice said, her heart overflowing. "Yes, Kenneth. I will." He kissed her then, in the cold winter garden, with the sound of Sophia's laughter ringing in the clear air. Epilogue. London, 1855. The ballroom of Kenswick House was ablaze with light. The cream of society had gathered for the first ball of the season, curiosity drawing many who wished to see the scarred Duchess, who had kept the Duke of Kenswick away from London for 3 years. When the doors opened and the Duke and Duchess were announced, a hush fell over the room. Beatrice stood at the top of the stairs, her hand on her husband's arm. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet that matched her husband's eyes, and diamonds glittered at her throat. Her hair was swept up, revealing the scar on her face for all to see. She did not hide it. She did not turn her head. She looked out at the crowd with a serene dignity that silenced the whispers. Beside her, the Duke looked at his wife with such evident pride and adoration that even the most cynical gossips felt a pang of envy. "Ready?" he whispered. "Ready," she replied. They descended the stairs together, not as a duke and a governess, but as partners who had faced the fire and come out stronger. And as they took the floor for the first waltz, Beatrice knew that she was no longer cast aside. She was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the man who had seen her soul and loved her for it.